He called her unfit, but when the Duke of Radcliffe saw what no one else had dared to, everything changed. Can the woman he publicly scorned be the one to teach him the true meaning of love? Or will his pride cost him the one chance at happiness he didn't see coming? Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Ballroom Affront. Greystoke, the Worthington estate blazed with autumn grandeur, a monument to wealth and tradition that dominated the Greystoke countryside like a jeweled crown. Lady Vivienne Thornton stood near a marble pillar in the grand ballroom, her violet eyes her one true claim to beauty, she'd been told, observing the glittering assembly with the detached precision of a natural philosopher examining specimens under glass. The ballroom itself was a masterpiece of excess. 3 massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, each cradling 50 candles that cast dancing shadows across silk-papered walls, the color of champagne. The air was thick with competing fragrances, hothouse roses arranged in towering displays, the waxy sweetness of burning candles, ladies' perfume lavender and bergamot, and something headier, and beneath it all, the faint smokiness of hearth fires burning in adjacent rooms. The rustle of taffeta and silk created a constant whisper, punctuated by the murmur of refined conversation and the lilting strains of a string quartet playing Mozart. It was the quintessential atmosphere of aristocratic elegance, and Vivienne felt suffocated by every gilded inch of it. "You're doing it again," Eleanor Bennet murmured, touching Vivienne's arm with gentle reproach. "That look that suggests you're cataloguing everyone's sins for future reference." Vivienne managed a slight smile for her dearest friend. Eleanor, the daughter of a prosperous solicitor, possessed both the practicality of the professional class and the loyalty of a sister. "Am I so transparent? Only to those who know you. To everyone else, you appear pleasantly composed." Eleanor leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Though I fear your composure may be tested. Lord Calloway has been staring at you for the past quarter hour." Vivienne followed Eleanor's discreet nod to where Lord Henry Calloway stood tall and distinguished, silver threading through his dark hair like frost on autumn branches. His urbane smile was fixed on her father, and the animated way Lord Thornton nodded made Vivienne's stomach tighten with unease. She knew what such conversations portended. Her family's financial troubles were hardly secret, and men like Calloway circled financial distress like carrion birds. But then her attention was pulled to a different figure entirely. Duke Maximilian Radcliffe stood near the great windows, autumn moonlight silhouetting his imposing frame against the darkness beyond. At 32, he possessed the bearing of a man who had never questioned his right to command any room he entered. His evening attire was impeccable black tailcoat, tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders, pristine white waistcoat, cravat tied in the intricate mathematical style that required both skill and patience. His dark hair was fashionably styled, swept back from a face that was more striking than handsome. Strong jaw, prominent cheekbones, and grey eyes that surveyed the assembly with the cool assessment of a general reviewing troops. He stood in conversation with Lord Blackwood and several other gentlemen, their heads bent in the serious discussion that marked men who believed their words shaped the world. "They're discussing the new factory acts," Eleanor murmured, her solicitor's daughter knowledge always reliable. "My father says Lord Blackwood is fighting to water down the worker protections." Vivienne's jaw tightened. She'd read about the proposed legislation in the newspapers, modest improvements to working conditions that would limit child labor hours and require basic safety measures. The industrialists and landowners were resisting with all their considerable political might, as if asking them not to work children to death was an unreasonable burden. The quartet fell silent with a flourish. Lady Worthington, resplendent in emerald silk that probably cost more than the Thornton household's annual expenses, stepped onto a small raised platform. Beside her stood the formidable Countess of Ashford, who chaired the Greystoke Ladies' Benevolent Society with the iron will of a military commander. "Distinguished guests," Lady Worthington's voice carried across the now hushed ballroom with practiced projection, "we gather tonight not merely for society's pleasures, but for a noble cause. This year's autumn charity collection will benefit the Derbyshire Displaced Families Fund, providing aid to tenant farmers who have lost their livelihoods due to the necessary agricultural improvements our estates require." Polite applause rippled through the assembly. Vivienne's hands remained still at her sides. Necessary improvements was such a genteel phrase for the enclosure movements that had driven families from lands their ancestors had farmed for generations, transforming common fields into private sheep pastures that required a fraction of the labor. The Countess continued, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "We are deeply honored that His Grace, the Duke of Westmere, has pledged to match tonight's contributions from his personal accounts." More enthusiastic applause as Maximilian stepped forward with practiced grace, mounting the platform with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to elevated positions. "It is our sacred duty," he began, his voice cultured and confident, each word precisely articulated, "to provide for those less fortunate during times of transition. The displacement of tenant families, while regrettable, represents progress, the modernization of agriculture that will ultimately benefit our nation's prosperity. These families will receive charitable support to help them find new occupations suited to their capabilities, whether in the factories or in service. It is far better to guide them toward productive futures than to allow them to cling to inefficient farming methods that benefit no one." Something inside Vivienne snapped a thread of restraint she hadn't realized was holding her together until it broke. Her voice rang out, clear and sharp as crystal shattering on marble. "And what of the tenant families displaced from your Derbyshire estates, Your Grace? Do they not deserve more than charity after generations of loyal service? They require justice, not condescension." The ballroom fell into shocked silence. Even the servants standing along the walls seemed to freeze mid-movement. Every eye in the assembly turned first to Vivienne, then swiveled as one to the Duke, as if watching a tennis match of social destruction. Eleanor's hand clutched Vivienne's arm in horror. "Vivienne, what have you?" But it was too late. Far, far too late. Maximilian's grey eyes locked onto Vivienne with laser precision, finding her unerringly in the crowd. His expression didn't change, no flash of anger, no widening of surprise, just cold, assessing interest, as if she were an unexpected piece on a chessboard he was now required to address. He descended from the platform with deliberate steps, each footfall measured and controlled. The crowd parted before him like water before a ship's prow, guests stumbling over themselves to clear his path. He stopped directly in front of her. Up close, he was even more imposing, easily 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that blocked out the rest of the room. His presence seemed to command the very air, making it harder to breathe. "And you are?" His voice was controlled, dangerous, each syllable precisely enunciated. Vivienne curtsied with precise correctness, years of deportment lessons taking over, even as her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her chin high, refusing to lower her eyes in the submissive manner expected. "Lady Vivienne Thornton, Your Grace." "Thornton." He spoke the name slowly, as if tasting it, testing its weight. "Lord Edmund Thornton's daughter. I see." His gaze traveled over her not lewdly, but with the same clinical assessment one might use when evaluating livestock at market. Taking inventory, finding her wanting. "Tell me, Lady Vivienne, what do you know of estate management, of crop yields and market forces, of the economic realities that govern agricultural reform?" "I know," Vivienne said steadily, though her heart threatened to burst through her chest, "that 23 families were evicted from your Derbyshire properties last spring to make way for sheep enclosures. I know that among them were the Mitchells, who had farmed their holding for 4 generations. I know that Mrs. Mitchell died of pneumonia in a Manchester workhouse 3 months ago because your necessary improvements left them with nowhere to go and no means of support." For the first time, something flickered in Maximilian's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or discomfort, or merely annoyance at being challenged with specific facts rather than vague sentiment. But whatever it was disappeared in an instant, shuttered behind aristocratic control. "You speak of matters you do not understand," he said coldly, his voice dropping in volume but gaining in intensity. "The Mitchells were offered compensation and assistance in finding new positions. If they chose to refuse sensible help and instead travel to Manchester, that was their decision. I cannot be held responsible for every poor choice made by those who lack the education and foresight to adapt to changing circumstances." "Perhaps," Vivienne said, her voice shaking now with barely controlled fury, "they lacked not education, but options. When one's entire life is upended by the stroke of a landlord's pen, adaptation becomes rather difficult." Maximilian's jaw tightened, the first visible crack in his composure. He leaned slightly closer, and she caught the scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something crisp, like winter air. His voice dropped so only those immediately nearby could hear. "You are an impertinent, presumptuous girl with romantic notions about the natural order of society. You speak of things that are not your concern in a manner that is wholly inappropriate for a woman of any breeding whatsoever." He straightened to his full height, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the ballroom with deliberate projection. "It is clear that some young ladies have been allowed too much freedom to form opinions on subjects beyond their capacity to understand." Then, turning to his companion, Lord Blackwood, but clearly intending for Vivian and everyone else to hear, he delivered the killing blow with casual cruelty. "That one is utterly unfit to be anyone's wife. No restraint, no proper feminine sensibility, and clearly no understanding of her proper place in society." The whispers exploded like gunfire, sharp, overlapping, merciless. Vivienne stood frozen, her face burning with humiliation and rage, a mortifying heat that spread from her cheeks down her neck. Eleanor tried to pull her away, tugging insistently at her arm, but before they could retreat, Lord Thornton appeared, materializing through the crowd with his face ashen with mortification. "Your Grace, I must apologize profusely for my daughter's unseemly outburst." Her father's voice was high and strained, nearly unrecognizable. "Papa, no," Vivienne began, but her father's sharp look silenced her more effectively than any words. Maximilian inclined his head with icy courtesy, the gesture somehow more insulting than any rebuke. "See that she learns better manners, Thornton, for her own sake." With that, he turned on his heel and strode away, the crowd parting before him once more, guests eager to demonstrate their alignment with power rather than principle. Lord Thornton gripped Vivian's arm not harshly, but firmly enough to brook no argument. "Come, we are leaving, now." The October night was cold, and Vivian had no wrap, but she welcomed the chill as she stood alone on the terrace. The stone beneath her feet radiated cold through her thin slippers. Her gown of deep plum silk, elegant but last-season style, a fact she was now acutely aware of, provided little protection against the autumn air, but the cold matched the ice in her chest, and that felt appropriate somehow. Unfit to be anyone's wife. The words echoed in her mind with the persistence of church bells, impossible to silence. She told herself she didn't care what that arrogant, privileged man thought. She told herself his opinion meant nothing, that the judgment of someone so divorced from ordinary human suffering was worthless. But her hands were shaking, and tears of fury and humiliation burned behind her eyes, threatening to spill over and complete her disgrace. "I will never apologize," she whispered to the night, to the uncaring stars, to herself. Never. Inside, the ball continued. Through the French doors, she could see the quartet playing again, couples forming sets for a country dance. The Duke danced with Lady Cordelia Ashworth, the beautiful widow with auburn hair and perfect manners. Guests clustered around them, offering congratulations on his generous charity, his public spirit, his admirable condescension in addressing an impertinent girl. And Vivienne stood in the cold, her garnet pendant her grandmother's, her only jewelry heavy against her throat. She felt the full weight of what she'd done, the social death she'd inflicted upon herself with a few reckless words of truth. She wondered if the momentary satisfaction of speaking that truth had been worth the cost. But even as she wondered, even as she shivered in the autumn night, she knew she would do it again. Some things, she thought, were worth the price, even if that price was everything. Chapter 2. Consequences and Complications. The morning room had once been Lady Catherine's pride, a bright, airy space where she would receive callers and write correspondence on cream-coloured paper embossed with the Thornton crest. Now it served as Vivian's refuge, though the word seemed ironic given how little refuge it actually provided. The once grand manor house showed its age in ways that pained Vivian to observe. Water stains bloomed across the drawing-room ceiling like grotesque flowers, evidence of a roof that needed repairs they couldn't afford. The curtains, once a rich burgundy velvet, had faded to the colour of old blood. Furniture that should have been reupholstered years ago sagged with exhaustion, springs visible through worn damask. The staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew. Mrs. Hewitt, the cook, Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, 2 maids who did the work of 6, and Thompson, their single remaining footman who served as butler, valet, and general factotum. Vivienne sat surrounded by newspapers and books, the Times, the Morning Chronicle, a treatise on political economy, John Stuart Mill's essays. She was reading accounts of the recent parliamentary debates on labour reforms, making notes in the margins with increasingly illegible handwriting, but her concentration was fractured, splintering like ice under pressure. The social consequences of the Worthington ball had been immediate and severe. Invitations had stopped arriving as abruptly as if a tap had been turned off. Former acquaintances crossed the street to avoid her, suddenly fascinated by shop windows on the opposite side. Even the vicar's wife had cornered Lady Catherine after Sunday service, delivering a pointed sermon about daughters who brought shame upon their families, suggesting that perhaps excessive education gave young women dangerous ideas above their station. Eleanor still visited, bless her loyal heart, arriving with her usual cheer and refusing to treat Vivienne like a pariah. But even Eleanor, ever optimistic, had admitted yesterday that Vivienne had become quite the scandal. Though personally, Eleanor had added with characteristic spirit, I think half of Greystoke is secretly delighted someone finally told the Duke he wasn't infallible. The other half, unfortunately, controlled society's opinion. The door opened without warning. Lady Catherine entered, carrying a silver tray with the morning's correspondence, what little there was these days. Her face was drawn with worry, new lines etched around her mouth and eyes. She'd aged visibly in recent weeks, her auburn hair showing more grey, her movements carrying a fragility that made Vivienne's chest ache with guilt. Vivienne, darling, there are developments we must discuss. The careful neutrality in her mother's voice sent alarm racing through Vivienne's veins. She set aside her reading, the pages of the Times crinkling in her suddenly tense grip. What sort of developments? Lady Catherine sat in the chair opposite, arranging her skirts with the nervous precision of someone preparing for an unpleasant task. The morning light, streaming through windows that needed washing, illuminated every worry line on her face. Your father had a meeting with our solicitor yesterday. The debts are worse than we thought. Much worse. Her voice wavered slightly. Without a significant infusion of capital, we may lose the estate by spring. The words hit like a physical blow, driving the air from Vivienne's lungs. She'd known things were difficult, the reduced staff, the repairs left undone, her father's increasingly haggard appearance, but this, how bad? She barely recognized her own voice, so small and hollow. Nearly £8,000. Vivienne's eyes closed involuntarily. It was a staggering sum, more than most families earned in a lifetime, more than a gentleman's annual income, more than could be raised by selling everything they owned. The house itself wasn't worth £8,000, not with its crumbling roof and outdated facilities. There is, however, a potential solution. Her mother's voice was carefully neutral, the tone one might use to discuss whether to serve fish or fowl at dinner. Lord Henry Calloway has formally approached your father. He's expressed serious interest in courting you with the intent of marriage. He's willing to settle our debts as part of the marriage settlement. Vivienne's stomach turned to ice, a cold spreading through her limbs that had nothing to do with the unheated room. No. Vivienne. No, Mama. Absolutely not. Lady Catherine's hands twisted in her lap, fingers knotting and unknotting in her faded morning dress. Darling, I understand this is not what you would have wished, but we must be practical. Lord Calloway is well-connected, wealthy, and by all accounts, a perfect gentleman. Many women would consider themselves fortunate. Then let one of them marry him. Vivienne. Her mother's voice turned sharp. Acquiring an edge Vivienne recognized from childhood, the tone that meant the conversation was over, the decision made. You are 24. Your behavior at the Worthington ball has made you unmarriageable to any respectable family. Lord Calloway is likely your only chance at a suitable match, and our only chance to save this estate and your father's honor. The guilt hit like a slap, stinging and immediate. This is my fault. Her outburst, her pride, her inability to hold her tongue, she'd destroyed not just her own prospects but her family's security. Her elderly parents would be cast out, forced to live on the charity of distant relations or in some cramped lodging house, their final years marked by poverty and shame. All because she couldn't remain silent in the face of injustice. That afternoon, Eleanor arrived with a basket of scones clearly made by her family's cook, since the Thorntons could no longer afford such luxuries, and an air of determined purpose that immediately put Vivienne on alert. Once they were settled in Vivienne's bedroom, the door firmly closed against eavesdropping servants, Eleanor pulled out a small leather-bound notebook with the gravity of a general presenting battle plans. "I've been making inquiries," she announced without preamble, "about Lord Calloway." "Eleanor, you shouldn't have." "Nonsense. You're my dearest friend, and something about that man makes my skin crawl. My father is a solicitor, remember? He has connections throughout the county, and solicitors gossip worse than housemaids." Eleanor flipped open her notebook, revealing pages of cramped handwriting. "What I've learned is disturbing." Vivienne leaned forward despite herself. "Calloway was married before his wife died 5 years ago in a riding accident. At least, that's the official story. But there were whispers. The coroner's inquest was rushed, the magistrate a personal friend of Calloway's. Lady Calloway's own family reportedly refused to attend the funeral." Eleanor's finger traced down her notes. "He lost his family estate to gambling debts shortly afterward, and has been rebuilding his fortune through strategic investments and, apparently, advantageous marriages to women from financially distressed families." Cold dread settled in Vivienne's stomach. "There's more," Eleanor continued grimly. "I wrote to my cousin Margaret, who lives near Calloway's current estate in Hampshire. She says the tenant families there live in appalling conditions, worse than any workhouse. No repairs to cottages, rents raised arbitrarily, children working in conditions that would violate even our inadequate factory acts." She paused, meeting Vivienne's eyes. "And 2 young women in his employ have simply disappeared. One was a maid named Sarah Collins, the other was a tenant's daughter, Margaret Price. No one knows what became of them. They just vanished." Vivienne felt cold all over, as if someone had opened a window to let winter in. Why hasn't anyone reported this? Who would they report it to? He's a peer of the realm. The magistrate in Hampshire is his personal friend, and deeply in his debt from gambling losses. And the families are terrified of eviction if they speak out. My cousin says they won't even discuss it except in whispers. This was worse than Vivienne had imagined, and her parents wanted her to marry this man, expected her to marry him, needed her to marry him. "What am I going to do?" she whispered. Eleanor squeezed her hand. "We'll think of something. We have to." The next day, Vivienne accompanied Eleanor to Greystoke's main thoroughfare, refusing to become a prisoner in her own home despite the whispers that followed her like shadows. She needed books from the lending library, and she would not let social censure dictate her movements. The autumn day was crisp and bright, the street bustling with carriages and pedestrians going about their business. Vivienne had just exited Halston and Sons booksellers, her arms full of volumes on agricultural reform and women's education, when she nearly collided with a broad chest encased in an impeccably tailored coat. She looked up into the cold grey eyes of Duke Maximilian Radcliffe. For a moment, neither spoke. The noise of the street horses' hooves on cobblestones, vendors calling their wares, the rattle of carriage wheels, seemed to fade to a distant hum. The air between them crackled with tension, memory of their confrontation, unspoken hostility, and something else Vivienne couldn't quite name. Something that made her pulse quicken traitorously. "Miss Thornton," his voice was formally polite, his bow correct but minimal, conveying all the required courtesy with none of the warmth. Vivienne curtsied with equal coolness, her books clutched against her chest like armor. "Your Grace." He'd just exited his solicitor's office. She could see the brass plaque on the door behind him. Crawford and Sons, solicitors and commissioners for oaths. His expression was unreadable, that aristocratic mask firmly in place, but there was something in his eyes. Discomfort? Guilt? Or simply distaste at encountering her again? Before either could move on, before Vivienne could escape this excruciating encounter, a jovial voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "Lady Vivienne, what a delightful surprise." Lord Henry Calloway approached with a broad smile, his walking stick tapping against the cobblestones in a jaunty rhythm. He was dressed fashionably in a coat of dark green superfine, his cravat tied in an elaborate oriental style. His manner exuded easy charm, the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to putting people at ease. But Vivienne, now armed with Eleanor's information, saw past the surface. She saw the calculation in his eyes as they swept over her, assessing, valuing. She saw the possessiveness in the way he positioned himself, subtly cutting off her escape route. She saw predation dressed in gentleman's clothing. "Lord Calloway," she kept her voice carefully neutral, the politeness of social obligation. "I had hoped to call upon you this week, with your father's permission, of course. Perhaps we might take a turn through the park? The autumn foliage is particularly lovely this time of year." His hand moved as if to take her arm, already claiming ownership. Vivian stepped back subtly, adjusting her grip on her books. How kind. However, my schedule is quite occupied at present. Surely not too occupied for a brief stroll. Calloway's smile didn't waver, but there was steel underneath the velvet, a hardness in his tone that made her skin crawl. Your father mentioned you're an avid reader. We have much to discuss regarding our future. Our future, as if it were already decided, already inevitable. Vivian felt trapped, her back nearly against the bookshop window. To refuse outright, here in public, would be outrageously rude and would devastate her father's negotiations. But to accept felt like stepping into a snare. Then Maximilian's voice cut in, surprising them both. Miss Thornton, I believe you dropped this. He held out a small, leather-bound volume, one of hers, she realized, though she had no memory of dropping it. His eyes met hers with an intensity that stole her breath, some unspoken message passing between them that she couldn't quite decipher. How careless of me, she managed, taking the book. Their fingers brushed the first time they'd touched, and she felt a jolt like electricity, shocking and immediate. One should take better care with one's possessions, Maximilian said, and though his tone remained cool and formal, there was something in his gaze that made her pulse race. Particularly items of value. Was he talking about the book? Or something else entirely? Calloway's smile had frozen, becoming a rictus of forced politeness. He recognized the interruption for what it was, a subtle challenge, a disruption of his territorial claim. Your Grace, I wasn't aware you were acquainted with Lady Vivian. We've met. Maximilian's tone was dismissive, as if their encounter had been too trivial to warrant elaboration. Then, turning back to Vivian with those penetrating grey eyes, I trust you'll be more careful in the future, Miss Thornton. Greystoke streets can be treacherous. One never knows what dangers lurk in plain sight. The warning was unmistakable, delivered with the precision of a rapier thrust. He knew something about Calloway, but why would he care? Why would the man who'd publicly declared her unfit for marriage concern himself with her welfare? Calloway's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Duke is overly cautious, I think. Lady Vivian is perfectly safe in my company. I'm certain she is, Maximilian said with elaborate politeness that somehow conveyed the opposite, his words carrying layers of meaning like a diplomatic communique. Good day, Miss Thornton. Lord Calloway. He inclined his head with perfect correctness and walked away, his broad shoulders cutting through the crowd with the ease of someone accustomed to deference. Vivian stood there, confused and shaken, her books heavy in her arms. Calloway's charm cooled noticeably, frost creeping into his urbane manner. The Duke seems rather interested in your welfare, Lady Vivian. How? Unexpected, given your recent encounter at the Worthington ball. I'm sure he was merely being courteous, Vivian said, though her heart was still racing, her mind replaying that moment when their fingers had touched. Of course. Calloway's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes, which had gone flat and cold. Now, about that walk. That evening, Maximilian sat in his study at Radcliffe Hall, a fire crackling in the marble hearth, a glass of excellent brandy sitting untouched on the leather-topped desk before him. He'd been staring at the same estate report for 20 minutes without reading a single word, the figures swimming meaninglessly across the page. He kept seeing Vivienne's violet eyes the way they'd widened when Calloway approached, the flicker of fear she'd tried to hide beneath that facade of composure, and Calloway himself, with his oily charm and predatory interest, circling her like a wolf around wounded prey. Maximilian knew Calloway's reputation, though not the full extent of his villainy. The man was a gambler, a social climber, known for marrying advantageously and emerging from each marriage substantially wealthier. There were whispers, always whispers, but nothing concrete enough to act upon, and now he was pursuing the Thornton girl. Why do I care? Maximilian asked himself angrily, turning the brandy glass in restless circles on the desk. She'd publicly humiliated him. She was impertinent, inappropriate, and completely unsuitable. A woman with no fortune, no significant connections, and opinions that would horrify any rational man. And yet, he remembered her words about the Mitchell family. He'd dismissed them in the moment, armor-plating of aristocratic certainty, deflecting criticism. But afterward, unable to sleep, he'd made inquiries. Mrs. Mitchell had indeed died in a workhouse, exactly as Vivian had claimed. The family had refused his steward's offer of employment because the positions were in factories with notoriously dangerous conditions. 12-hour days in buildings that routinely caught fire or collapsed, and Mr. Mitchell was too old, his lungs too damaged from decades of agricultural work, to survive such labor. Maximilian had told himself it wasn't his responsibility. The law was entirely on his side. The enclosures were economically necessary, approved by Parliament, supported by every economic theorist of note. But her words haunted him, echoing in his mind during sleepless nights. Perhaps they lacked, not education, but options. He drained the brandy in one burning swallow and reached for the bell pull with decision. When his secretary appeared, Mr. Harris, who'd served the family for 20 years, Maximilian spoke without preamble. "I need you to investigate Lord Henry Calloway. Everything, his finances, his estates, his reputation, his first marriage. Be discreet, but be thorough. I want the information by week's end." Harris's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only sign of surprise he ever permitted himself, but he bowed with professional composure. "Of course, Your Grace. May I inquire as to the nature of your interest?" "You may not." "Very good, Your Grace." Alone again, Maximilian stared into the fire, watching flames consume oak logs that had once been living trees, and wondered what the hell he was doing. 3 days later, an elegant invitation arrived at the Thornton residence, delivered by a liveried footman on a magnificent bay horse. "Lord and Lady Blackwood request the pleasure of Lady Vivienne Thornton's company at a fortnight's house party at Blackwood Manor, commencing the 15th of November. Lady Catherine nearly fainted with relief, clutching the thick cream paper to her chest as if it were a reprieve from execution. An invitation from the Blackwoods, one of Yorkshire's most prominent families, meant Vivienne hadn't been completely ostracized. There was still hope for her social redemption, still a chance to salvage something from the wreckage of the Worthington ball. "You must attend," her mother insisted, following Vivienne to the morning room where she'd tried to escape. "This is an opportunity to restore your reputation. Lord Calloway will be there." "How wonderful," Vivienne said flatly, staring at the invitation as if it were a summons to the gallows. "And you must be on your best behavior. No politics, no arguments about workers' rights or agricultural reform, no impropriety of any kind. Simply be pleasant and agreeable. Simply be someone else entirely," Vivienne thought but didn't say. That evening, Eleanor arrived with news that made Vivienne's stomach perform an elaborate acrobatic maneuver. "The Duke will also be attending," Eleanor announced, perched on Vivienne's bed like a conspirator. "Lady Blackwood apparently considers him an excellent match for her niece, Lady Cordelia Ashworth. She's been trying to throw them together for months." Vivienne's stomach did an odd flip, a sensation she refused to examine too closely. She told herself it was dread at the prospect of encountering him again, of enduring his cold disdain and aristocratic superiority for an entire fortnight. She told herself she was lying. 2 weeks, she murmured, staring at the invitation with its elegant copperplate script. 2 weeks to navigate between a predator and a duke who despises me. What could possibly go wrong? Eleanor squeezed her hand, her grip warm and reassuring. "I'll be there too. Lord Blackwood invited my family. My father did some legal work for him last year. Whatever happens, you won't face it alone." Small comfort, but Vivienne took it, holding onto Eleanor's hand like a lifeline. Outside, autumn darkness fell early, swallowing the dilapidated manor house in shadows. And in the distance, at Radcliffe Hall, Maximilian Radcliffe sat in his study, reading a preliminary report on Lord Henry Calloway that made his blood run cold. The game, though neither of them knew it yet, had already begun. Chapter 3. Blackwood Manor. The ancestral estate sprawled across rolling Yorkshire countryside like a testament to centuries of accumulated wealth and power. As the Thornton carriage, hired at considerable expense, the family's own having been sold 2 years prior, wound up the long drive, Vivienne pressed her face to the window, observing the manicured grounds with the careful attention of someone cataloguing a world she didn't quite belong to. Autumn trees blazed with colour, oaks burnished gold, maples crimson as spilled wine, copper beeches glowing bronze in the afternoon sun. A small herd of fallow deer grazed in the park, lifting their heads briefly as the carriage passed before returning to their aristocratic indifference. The manor house itself rose before them, a magnificent Tudor structure bristling with chimneys, its original timber and stone softened by later Georgian additions that added symmetry and classical proportion. Windows gleamed in the afternoon light like watching eyes, dozens of them, reflecting the departing sun. The house party would last 5 days, an eternity under the circumstances. Approximately 20 guests had been invited, representing Yorkshire's most prominent families. Vivienne recognized several carriages already in the courtyard: the Ashworths' elegant barouche, Lord Pemberton's travelling coach with its ducal crest, the Bennets' sensible but well-maintained vehicle. Her father hadn't been able to afford to accompany them. The trip itself had stretched their finances to breaking point, requiring the pawning of Lady Catherine's pearl bracelet. So Vivienne and her mother travelled alone, and Lady Catherine had spent the entire 3-hour journey coaching her daughter with increasing desperation. Be pleasant, Vivienne. Be demure. Smile at Lord Calloway's attentions, encourage them even, and for heaven's sake, avoid the Duke entirely. No arguments, no politics, no mention of tenant farmers or workers' rights or any other unsuitable topics. Her mother's hands had twisted in her lap, knotting and unknotting until Vivienne had feared she'd damage her gloves. This is your chance to repair the damage from the Worthington ball. Please, darling, don't waste it. Now, as a footman in immaculate livery helped them from the carriage, Vivienne felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. The dinner party, that first evening, was a glittering affair that would have impressed royalty. 24 guests seated at a massive mahogany table that had reportedly been carved from a single tree felled on the estate 2 centuries ago. Silver candelabra marched down its length, their candles reflecting in crystal glasses and polished silver that represented more wealth than the Thorntons had seen in a decade. Course after elaborate course emerged from the kitchens, served by an army of footmen moving in choreographed silence. Turtle soup, turbot in lobster sauce, roasted game birds, beef à la mode, vegetables in aspic, elaborate confections that were more architecture than food. Vivienne found herself seated between Sir Gerald Hartwick, a pompous baronet who spoke exclusively about his hunting dogs, Brutus's excellent nose, Caesar's stamina, Hannibal's regrettable tendency to chase sheep, and an elderly gentleman who appeared to be half asleep. Directly across from her, with the inevitability of divine punishment, sat Duke Maximilian Radcliffe. Lady Cordelia Ashworth occupied the chair beside him, commanding his attention with practiced grace. She was genuinely lovely auburn hair arranged in an intricate coiffure adorned with pearls, creamy skin that suggested she'd never worked a day in harsh sunlight, elegant manners that made every gesture appear effortless. She was also kind, Vivienne noted, with grudging admiration, inquiring warmly about Lady Catherine's health and making Vivienne feel almost welcome in a room where she decidedly was not. "My uncle speaks so highly of your family, Lady Vivienne," Cordelia said with a smile that reached her hazel eyes. "The Thorntons have such distinguished history in this region. Why? Wasn't it your great-grandfather who served as magistrate during the Jacobite troubles?" It was a generous lie. The Thornton history was mostly one of slow decline, punctuated by unfortunate investments and gambling debts. But Vivienne appreciated the gesture, the social grace that smoothed over awkwardness. "You're very kind, Lady Cordelia, though I fear our family's distinguished history is somewhat exaggerated by time and charitable memory." "Nonsense. Heritage is in the blood, not the bank balance." Cordelia's eyes flickered briefly to Maximilian, as if checking whether he'd heard this pointed remark. Maximilian said nothing throughout this exchange, but Vivienne felt his gaze on her throughout the meal like a physical touch. Every time she glanced up, and she tried not to, tried to focus on Sir Gerald's tedious monologue about optimal breeding practices for foxhounds, their eyes met for a charged instant before both looked away, a dance of avoidance that somehow felt more intimate than conversation. Lord Calloway was seated farther down the table, between Lady Blackwood and another matron, whose name Vivienne couldn't recall. He caught Vivienne's eye as the third course was being served, and raised his glass in a subtle toast, his smile possessive, proprietary. The look in his eyes made her skin crawl, as if he were already calculating how best to use her, how to extract maximum value from an acquisition. She looked away quickly, her appetite vanishing entirely. When the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, that peculiar English custom that separated the sexes so gentlemen could drink port and discuss politics while ladies gossiped over tea, Vivienne found herself cornered by Lady Blackwood, a formidable woman in her 50s with sharp grey eyes and sharper wit. Her gown of midnight blue silk was severe but elegant, and she wore diamonds with the casual indifference of someone who owned too many to count. "Lady Vivienne, you've become quite the topic of conversation in recent weeks." Vivienne braced herself for censure, for the cutting remarks she'd endured from other society matrons. "I'm aware, Lady Blackwood. I apologize if my presence causes discomfort to you or your guests." "Discomfort?" Lady Blackwood laughed, a surprisingly rich sound that turned several heads. "My dear, you've enlivened a tediously dull season. Half of society thinks you're scandalously bold, and the other half secretly wishes they had your courage. The Duke needed taking down a peg or two. He's been insufferably sure of himself since his uncle pushed him into Parliament last year. This was entirely unexpected." Vivienne blinked, searching for the trap in such apparent approval. "Thank you, my lady." "Don't thank me yet. You've made a powerful enemy, child, and if you're not careful, you'll find yourself married to Henry Calloway." Lady Blackwood's voice dropped, her tone shifting from amused to serious in an instant. She drew Vivienne toward the window, away from the other ladies' hearing. "A word of advice, my dear. Calloway is charming, wealthy, and absolutely ruthless. I knew his first wife, poor Margaret. She wasn't clumsy, despite what the inquest concluded. Watch yourself around him, and if you value your future, encourage Lady Cordelia's pursuit of the Duke. Maximilian Radcliffe needs a wife, preferably one who'll keep him too occupied to hold grudges against impertinent young ladies who challenge his authority." The warning settled in Vivienne's stomach like cold lead. Before she could respond, Lady Blackwood had moved away, swept up in conversation with another guest, leaving Vivienne to wonder whether she'd just received a lifeline or a death sentence. The next morning brought organized entertainments designed to display genteel accomplishments and facilitate courtship. Archery on the south lawn, croquet, and riding for those who wished it. The November day was crisp but clear, the kind of autumn morning that made Yorkshire seem like paradise despite its harsh winters. Vivienne excelled at archery. Her father had taught her as a girl, one of the few purely pleasurable memories from her childhood before financial troubles had consumed their family life. She stepped up to the line, feeling the smooth wood of the bow beneath her fingers, the familiar tension of the string. The target stood 50 yards distant, painted circles of white and red and gold. She knocked her arrow, feeling 24 pairs of eyes on her, drew the string back, feeling the resistance, the power, breathed, centering herself as her father had taught her, released, thwack, dead center, the gold. Polite applause from the assembled guests. She glanced up to find Maximilian watching from beneath an ancient oak tree, his expression unreadable, arms crossed over his broad chest. When their eyes met, he didn't look away, neither did she, caught in that strange magnetic pull she couldn't explain and didn't want to examine. She fired 2 more arrows, both center strikes, muscle memory and years of practice overriding her nervousness. "Remarkable skill, Lady Vivienne." Lord Calloway appeared at her elbow as if materializing from shadow, uninvited and unwanted. "You're a woman of many talents, it seems. I do so appreciate capability in a potential wife." The presumption in his words made her stiffen, her hands tightening on the bow. "You're very kind, Lord Calloway, but I'm merely adequate at best." Modesty ill becomes you. His hand settled on her lower back, too familiar, too possessive, his touch making her want to flinch away. "I've spoken extensively with your father. I believe we can come to a mutually beneficial arrangement quite soon. Perhaps we might announce our understanding before this house party concludes?" Vivienne stepped away from his touch, lowering the bow. "Lord Calloway, I must be frank. Miss Thornton is wanted for the ladies' croquet match," a cool voice interrupted, cutting through the moment like a knife through silk. Maximilian stood there, closer than she'd realized, his grey eyes fixed on Calloway's hand, which had dropped from Vivienne's back but hovered possessively near her waist. "Your Grace." Calloway's smile was all teeth, predatory and false. "How remarkably attentive you are to Lady Vivienne's schedule. One might almost think you had a personal interest in her whereabouts." "Lady Blackwood sent me to fetch her," Maximilian said flatly, the lie delivered with aristocratic conviction. "The teams are waiting." It was probably complete fabrication. Lady Blackwood had sent no such summons, but it provided escape, and Vivienne seized it with both hands. "Of course. Please excuse me, Lord Calloway." As she walked away with Maximilian, a bizarre alliance between former adversaries, she murmured low enough that only he could hear, "Thank you, though I'm surprised you'd assist me after everything." "I wasn't assisting you," Maximilian said curtly, his jaw tight. "I was preventing a scene. Calloway's attentions were becoming inappropriate, and this is Lady Blackwood's home. I won't have her hospitality abused." "Of course," Vivienne said, her voice cooling to match his. How foolish of me to think you might possess an ounce of human decency beneath all that aristocratic arrogance." He stopped walking abruptly, turning to face her with controlled fury. "You have remarkable audacity for someone in your position, Miss Thornton, and you have remarkable arrogance for someone who claims to care about propriety while standing aside as women are." She stopped herself, remembering Eleanor's warnings about Calloway's disappeared servants, the investigations that went nowhere. She couldn't say too much, without revealing what she knew, without exposing Eleanor's family to risk. Maximilian's eyes narrowed, intelligence sharpening his gaze. "As women are what? Finish your thought." "Nothing. Forgive me." She started to walk away, toward where the other ladies were indeed gathering for croquet. His hand caught her elbow gently, but firmly enough to stop her flight. "Miss Thornton, if you know something about Calloway that concerns you, you should speak. There are channels for such information." She looked up at him, searching his face for signs of mockery, for the trap she was certain must be there. His expression was serious, almost concerned. "Why would you care what happens to me? You called me unfit. You think I'm inappropriate and presumptuous." Something flickered in his grey eyes, something almost vulnerable, quickly shuttered. "Perhaps I'm not entirely the monster you believe me to be." Before Vivian could respond, before she could process what that might mean, Eleanor appeared, slightly breathless. "There you are. Lady Blackwood wants us for— Oh, Your Grace, I didn't see you there." Maximilian released Vivian's arm immediately, stepping back with formal distance. "I was just leaving. Good day, ladies." He strode away with purposeful steps, leaving Vivian confused and unsettled, her elbow still warm where his fingers had pressed. Eleanor watched him go, then turned to Vivienne with eyes wide as saucers. "What was that? Vivienne, what just happened?" "I have absolutely no idea." That evening, after another interminable dinner, where she'd endured Sir Gerald's discourse on proper seasoning for hunting dog food, Vivienne escaped to Blackwood Manor's famous library. 3 stories of books climbed the walls, reached by a rolling ladder of polished brass and mahogany. Comfortable leather chairs sat before a marble fireplace, where a fire crackled warmly. The smell of old paper and leather bindings was intoxicating, better than any perfume. She was examining a first edition of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, running her fingers reverently over the spine, when she heard footsteps on the hardwood floor. Maximilian stood in the doorway, holding a book of his own, a technical volume on agricultural improvements, she noted with bitter irony. For a long moment, neither spoke. The library felt suddenly smaller, the air charged with unspoken tension, with all the words they'd traded and all the ones they hadn't. "I didn't expect to find anyone here," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Nor did I," Vivian replied, clutching Adam Smith like armor. "I can leave if my presence disturbs you." "Don't." The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended, almost desperate. He moderated his tone, regaining control. "That is, you were here first. I'll take a chair on the other side of the room. We need not speak." But he didn't move to the other side of the room. Instead, he approached, drawn as if by invisible threads, his eyes on the book in her hands. "Adam Smith," he observed, something like respect in his voice. "Unusual reading for a lady. I'm an unusual lady, as you've made abundantly clear to all of Yorkshire society." A ghost of something regret, crossed his face. So it would seem. He reached past her to pull a book from the shelf, a recent treatise on the Highland clearances, she saw. They were standing very close now, close enough that she could smell his cologne, sandalwood and something crisp and clean, like winter air and snow, close enough to see the faint shadow of beard along his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar, despite the rigorous styling. "Do you ever doubt it?" she asked quietly, the question escaping before she could stop it. "The rightness of it all? The enclosures, the evictions, the progress that costs so much in human suffering?" Maximilian was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost vulnerable, stripped of its usual aristocratic certainty. "Every day. But doubt doesn't change economic reality, Miss Thornton. Sentiment doesn't feed England's growing population or power its factories. The old ways are dying, and I can either manage that change responsibly or watch chaos consume everything my family built over centuries. And the Mitchells?" She met his eyes directly, refusing to look away. Was their suffering part of responsible management? His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping. "I made inquiries. After our encounter, you were right about Mrs. Mitchell's death, and about the factory positions my steward offered. They were deplorable. I hadn't known the conditions, hadn't inspected them personally. I've since severed our relationship with that manufacturer. Vivienne stared at him, genuinely stunned. You changed your practices? Because of what I said? Don't sound so shocked. I'm not incapable of self-examination. He set his book down on a nearby table, turning to face her fully. You were right about some things, Miss Thornton, and wrong about others. I am not a heartless villain who delights in suffering, but neither am I a romantic fool who believes good intentions can replace sound economics. The world is more complicated than your newspapers suggest. I never thought you delighted in suffering, Vivienne said softly. Honestly, I thought you ignored it. There's a difference. Is there? His voice carried bitterness like an aftertaste. The result is the same. People suffer, families are destroyed, and men like me tell ourselves we had no choice. They were standing very close now. Vivienne realized she was still clutching Adam Smith like a shield between them, as if ideas about market forces could protect her from whatever this feeling was. Why did you really intervene this afternoon? She asked. With Lord Calloway? Maximilian's expression hardened, aristocratic control reasserting itself. Because I've been making inquiries about him as well. What I've learned is troubling. His first wife's death was ruled an accident, but there were inconsistencies in the coroner's report that were never explained. 2 women from his employ have vanished without trace. His tenants live in conditions that would shame a workhouse master, and yet he's presenting himself as a respectable suitor to your family. Vivienne's blood ran cold, ice spreading through her veins. How do you know about his courtship of me? Your father consulted with my man of affairs about the legal aspects of settling debts through marriage settlements. The man came to me with concerns about Calloway's reputation. Maximilian's eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity. Your father is desperate, Miss Thornton. He's considering selling you to a predator to save his estate. The bluntness of it hit like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. That's not he wouldn't he? Maximilian's voice gentled slightly, losing its edge. Desperate men do desperate things. Even good men. Even loving fathers. Vivienne turned away, blinking back tears that burned behind her eyes, refusing to let them fall. And what do you suggest I do? Refuse him and let my family lose everything? Become a burden, a spinster daughter living on charity while my parents age in poverty and shame? That's the choice I have: marry a monster or destroy my family. Some choice. You could marry someone else. She laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. Who? I've made myself unmarriageable, remember? According to no less an authority than yourself, I'm utterly unfit to be anyone's wife. Too opinionated, too bold, too everything that's wrong with modern young women. Silence fell, heavy and weighted with meaning. When she finally turned back, Maximilian was watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher, something between regret and something else, something that made her pulse quicken traitorously. I spoke rashly, he said quietly, each word carefully chosen. In anger, in wounded pride. You challenged me publicly, and I lashed out like a child denied his way. But I've come to realize you're not unfit. You're uncomfortably honest in a world that prizes comfortable lies. That's not unfitness, Miss Thornton. That's courage. Vivienne's breath caught in her throat. Are you apologizing? I'm stating facts as I've come to understand them. It sounded remarkably like an apology. The corner of his mouth twitched almost a smile, quickly suppressed. Perhaps I'm capable of those as well, on rare occasions. Footsteps in the corridor outside made them both start, reality intruding on their bubble of intimacy. They stepped apart quickly, propriety remembered just in time. Lady Cordelia entered, her expression cooling slightly when she saw them together, alone, standing closer than strictly proper. Maximilian, I've been looking everywhere for you. Lady Blackwood is organizing charades in the drawing room. She specifically requested your participation. Of course. He bowed to Vivienne with formal correctness, all warmth draining from his expression. Miss Thornton, good evening. Your Grace. As he left with Cordelia, Vivienne caught a last glance from him, something questioning, uncertain, almost vulnerable. Then he was gone, and she was alone with Adam Smith and her racing thoughts. Eleanor appeared moments later, eyes wide with barely contained excitement. Vivienne, everyone is talking about how you and the Duke were seen walking together this afternoon, And now you're alone together in the library. Do you have any idea what people are saying?" "Nothing happened," Vivienne said. "Quickly, too quickly." "Something happened," Eleanor insisted, coming closer to study her friend's face. "Your face is flushed, and you look like you've seen a ghost. Or perhaps something worse than a ghost." Vivienne sank into a leather armchair, Adam Smith forgotten in her lap. "I think," she said slowly, trying to make sense of it herself, "I've just had an actual conversation with Maximilian Radcliffe. And it wasn't horrible. He apologized, sort of, and he's investigating Calloway." "That's worrying," Eleanor said dryly, settling into the chair opposite. "I know. What are you going to do?" "I have absolutely no idea." Late that night, Vivienne lay awake in her assigned bedchamber, a beautiful room with blue silk wallpaper and windows overlooking the park, as moonlight streamed through the curtains she'd forgotten to close. The house was silent, all the guests retired, but her mind raced like horses at Ascot. Maximilian knew about Calloway. He'd investigated independently. He'd warned her, helped her, apologized to her. Why? And more troubling, why did she care so much about his reasons? She remembered his words, turning them over like precious stones. "You're not unfit. You're uncomfortably honest in a world that prizes comfortable lies." It wasn't flowery or romantic. It wasn't poetry. But it felt true. And somehow, that mattered more than any flowery declaration, more than any practiced compliment. He'd seen her, truly seen her, and called it courage instead of impropriety. Down the corridor, in his own chambers, Maximilian stood at the window in his shirt sleeves, looking out over Blackwood's moonlit grounds. Sleep had eluded him since that moment in the library. He was thinking of violet eyes and passionate arguments, of a woman who wouldn't bow to him or flatter him or treat him like a title instead of a man. "What am I doing?" he asked himself, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. But he knew the answer, even if he wasn't ready to admit it, even if admitting it would complicate everything beyond repair. Everything was about to become far more complicated, and neither of them could stop it now, even if they wanted to. Chapter 4. Investigations and Manipulations. Day 3. Morning. The morning brought rain, a cold November downpour that transformed Blackwood Manor's elegant grounds into a watercolor study in grey and green. Water streamed from gargoyles' mouths, pooled in garden paths, and drummed against window panes with the persistence of an unwelcome guest. The house party guests, denied their outdoor amusements, gathered instead in the music room, the conservatory, the card rooms, anywhere that offered diversion from the relentless Yorkshire weather. Vivienne found herself summoned to the drawing room, where Lady Blackwood had organized what she called improving entertainments, parlor games designed to encourage interaction between eligible men and women with all the subtlety of a cavalry charge. "We shall have a puzzle competition," Lady Blackwood announced with evident satisfaction. "Couples will work together to solve various riddles and mechanical puzzles. The first pair to complete their challenge wins a prize and, more importantly, demonstrates the kind of intellectual harmony that makes for successful marriages." The last part was delivered with a meaningful look at the unmarried guests. Vivienne wanted to sink through the Aubusson carpet. The pairings were clearly orchestrated. Lady Cordelia had been matched with Lord Pemberton, Maximilian's elderly uncle, which she handled with gracious good humour, engaging the pompous old man in conversation about his prized rose garden. Lord Calloway had been paired with Miss Henrietta Ashford, a giggly debutante of perhaps 17 who blushed and stammered whenever he spoke to her, which left Calloway visibly disgruntled, his smile tight and false. And Vivienne, through what could only be Lady Blackwood's deliberate mischief, found herself partnered with Duke Maximilian Radcliffe. "This is mortifying," Vivienne muttered as they took their seats at a small mahogany table in the corner, a carved wooden puzzle box placed between them like a challenge. "Agreed," Maximilian said dryly, his long fingers already examining the box's mechanisms. "Lady Blackwood's matchmaking is about as subtle as cannon fire. I half expect her to simply lock us in a room together and be done with it." Despite the awkwardness, or perhaps because of it, they worked well together. The puzzle was an intricate Chinese box with rotating rings and hidden catches, requiring both logic and lateral thinking to solve. Vivienne's quick wit, her ability to see patterns and connections, combined effectively with Maximilian's methodical approach, his systematic testing of each mechanism. "Try rotating the third ring counterclockwise while holding the second ring steady," Vivienne suggested, leaning closer to observe the box's inner workings. That won't actually. Wait. Maximilian adjusted his grip, his large hands surprisingly deft as he followed her suggestion. Something clicked deep within the mechanism, a satisfying sound of tumblers falling into place. How did you see that? Different perspective, she said with a small smile meeting his eyes. Sometimes the solution isn't more force or more complexity. Sometimes it's just looking at the problem from a different angle. Is that a metaphor, Miss Thornton? Everything is a metaphor if you're paying attention, Your Grace. They solved their puzzle first, the box opening to reveal a small golden key nested in red velvet. Applause rippled through the drawing room, polite from most guests, enthusiastic from Lady Blackwood, decidedly cool from Lord Calloway, whose puzzle remained stubbornly unsolved, despite Miss Henrietta's increasingly nervous suggestions. As the room broke for refreshments, tea and delicate cakes arranged on silver salvers, Maximilian leaned close, his voice pitched for Vivian's ears alone. I received information about Calloway last night, from my investigator in London. We need to speak privately. Vivian's breath caught. When? The conservatory, after luncheon. Bring Miss Bennet if propriety concerns you, but tell no one else. The conservatory was a glass palace at the manor's east wing, filled with exotic plants that had no business surviving in Yorkshire's harsh climate. Palms from Africa stretched toward the glass ceiling, their fronds spreading wide. Orchids from South America bloomed in impossible colors, purple and pink and electric blue. The air was humid, thick with the scent of earth and flowers and growing things, a pocket of tropical warmth while rain drummed against the glass overhead in relentless percussion. Vivian and Eleanor arrived first, moving between the plant displays with nervous energy. Eleanor touched a leaf, then drew back quickly. I feel like we're in some Gothic novel. Secret meetings in conservatories, investigations, dangerous men. This isn't a novel, Vivian said quietly. This is my life. Maximilian entered moments later, glancing around to ensure they were alone before closing the conservatory door firmly behind him. He carried a leather document folder under his arm, and his expression was grimmer than Vivian had yet seen it. What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room, he began without preamble, without the social niceties that usually govern such interactions. My investigator has uncovered information that is both damning and dangerous. If Calloway learns we know these things, he may act rashly. He spread documents across a wrought iron table, arranging them with methodical precision. As Vivian leaned forward to read, horror grew in her chest like ice forming on a winter pond. Evidence. Item 1. A contract showing Calloway had sold his first wife's dowry properties, 3 profitable farms in Sussex, immediately after her death. Despite the properties being legally entailed to any future children of the marriage, the sale had raised £15,000, all of which had vanished into Calloway's creditors' pockets within a year. Evidence Item 2. Written testimony from a former servant named Mrs. Agnes Thornbury, now living in Edinburgh on a generous pension that had bought her silence for 5 years. She testified that Lady Calloway's riding accident had occurred not in the stables, but in the manor house itself, after the couple had engaged in a violent argument over his gambling debts. Mrs. Thornbury had heard screams, crashes, breaking glass, then terrible silence. When she'd gone to investigate, she'd found Lady Calloway at the bottom of the grand staircase, her neck broken, her eyes open and unseeing. Lord Calloway had been standing over her body, white-faced and shaking. He'd claimed she'd fallen, that she'd been drinking, that it was a tragic accident. The inquest had agreed, asked no difficult questions, rendered its verdict in less than an hour. My God, Eleanor breathed, her hand pressed to her mouth. He's a murderer. Possibly, Maximilian said grimly, his jaw tight. Provable in a court of law? That's another matter entirely. The evidence is circumstantial. No court would convict a peer of the realm on a servant's testimony alone, particularly when that servant accepted money for her silence. Evidence. Item 3. Legal documents showing 3 separate attempts by tenant families to bring formal complaints about Calloway's practices to the Hampshire magistrate, complaints about withheld wages, unsafe housing conditions, excessive rents. All 3 complaints had been dismissed without investigation. Further research revealed that the magistrate, Sir Robert Henley, owed Calloway substantial gambling debts, nearly £3,000 accumulated over years of card games at their gentlemen's club. Evidence Item 4. Financial records obtained through sources. Maximilian declined to name, indicating Calloway was deeply in debt to several very dangerous creditors, including a notorious moneylender named Silas Crowe, known throughout London for his violent collection methods. Men who couldn't pay Crowe often disappeared or turned up in the Thames with suspicious injuries ruled as drownings. Calloway owed Crowe £8,000, due by year's end. If he couldn't pay, his life wasn't worth a farthing. "He needs to marry money urgently," Maximilian said quietly, "or face ruin, possibly worse than ruin. But we can use this to stop him from pursuing Vivienne," Eleanor insisted, her solicitor's daughter mind already working through possibilities. "We can threaten to expose him." "Can we?" Vivienne's voice was hollow, empty. "If I refuse him, he'll call in my father's debts immediately. According to these documents, he purchased them 2 weeks ago for £6,000, probably at a significant discount. We'll lose everything. The house, the land, everything. And Calloway will simply find another desperate family, another vulnerable woman with no one to protect her. We won't have saved anyone. We'll just have chosen ourselves over the next victim." Silence fell, broken only by the rain against glass and Eleanor's sharp intake of breath. Then Maximilian said quietly, "There's another option, a temporary one, to buy us time." "What option?" He looked distinctly uncomfortable, his aristocratic composure cracking to reveal uncertainty beneath. "Calloway is pursuing you because you represent his best available option, significant debt to clear. Your family's desperation makes you controllable, and your father's eagerness makes negotiation unnecessary. If you were to become unavailable, he'd need to look elsewhere, which would give us time to build an unassailable case without you being forced into an immediate decision." Understanding dawned on Vivienne's face like sunrise after a terrible night. "You mean if I appeared to be courting someone else? Someone Calloway couldn't intimidate or challenge?" "Precisely." Eleanor's eyes widened to the size of saucers. "You're suggesting the Duke court, Vivienne. A fake courtship." "A strategic courtship," Maximilian corrected stiffly, his shoulders straightening with that aristocratic pride she recognized. "Purely for appearances. We attend public events together. I call at her home. We give every impression of serious romantic interest. It would accomplish 2 things: protect Miss Thornton from Calloway's immediate pressure, and allow my investigator time to find the missing women, gather more evidence, build a case that will destroy Calloway socially, if not legally." Vivienne stared at him, unable to process this suggestion. "You hate me. You called me unfit to be anyone's wife in front of half of Yorkshire society." "I don't hate you," Maximilian said, and there was surprising heat in his voice, passion breaking through his usual control. "And I've already apologized for that comment. Will you hold it against me indefinitely? It's been less than a month. Time enough for reconsideration. Time enough to recognize when I've been wrong." He straightened, his tone becoming formal again, retreating into aristocratic distance. "This is a practical solution to a dangerous problem. Nothing more. Once Calloway is exposed and your family's debts are managed through other means, we can end the charade with minimal scandal, a mutual recognition that we wouldn't suit. Society will understand." "Other means?" Vivienne's pride bristled like a cat's fur. "If you're suggesting charity, I'm suggesting a properly structured loan through my bank with reasonable terms and proper collateral. Business, not charity. Your father keeps his dignity and his estate. I receive a modest return on investment with excellent security. Everyone wins. It's commerce, Miss Thornton. Nothing more." It was logical, practical, cold-bloodedly sensible. And Vivienne knew, with sinking certainty, that it was her only real option. "What about Lady Cordelia?" she asked quietly, thinking of the kind woman who'd made her feel welcome. "She clearly has expectations regarding you. Everyone says you're practically engaged." Something flickered in Maximilian's expression, guilt, perhaps, or regret. "Cordelia and I have an understanding. There's no formal arrangement. Her aunt hopes, society assumes, but Cordelia herself has no particular expectations. I'll speak with her privately. She deserves honesty." "This is insane," Eleanor muttered, looking between them as if they'd both lost their minds. "You two can barely have a civil conversation without arguing. How do you expect to convince anyone you're courting?" "We managed a civil conversation in the library yesterday," Maximilian pointed out with infuriating logic. "That's one conversation. Then we'll have more." Maximilian looked at Vivienne directly, his grey eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. "I'm offering you a way out, Miss Thornton, a chance to protect yourself without sacrificing your family. The question is, can you set aside your pride long enough to accept help? It was a challenge, deliberately phrased to provoke her stubbornness. And despite everything, despite the fear and uncertainty and the sheer madness of what he was proposing, Vivienne almost smiled, because she recognized the tactic. He was using her own nature to manipulate her into agreement, playing on her refusal to back down from challenges. Clever man. Dangerous man. Fine, she said, lifting her chin. But we do this as equals. You don't make decisions about my life without consulting me. This is a partnership, not a rescue. I'm not some damsel waiting to be saved. Agreed. They shook hands, formal, businesslike, sealing their pact like a commercial contract. But when his fingers closed around hers, large and warm and surprisingly gentle, Vivienne felt that same electric jolt from their previous touch, that current that seemed to run between them unbidden. From the look on his face, the way his eyes widened fractionally before his control reasserted itself, he felt it too. Eleanor groaned, pressing her hands to her face. This is going to end in disaster. I can feel it. You two are going to destroy each other, or fall in love, or both, and it's going to be spectacular and terrible, and I'm going to have to watch it all unfold. Don't be dramatic, Vivienne said, though her hand still tingled where he'd touched it. I'm never dramatic. I'm a realist, and realistically, this plan is madness. Do you have a better suggestion? Maximilian asked. Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it. No, which is perhaps the worst part of all. That evening at dinner, the dining room was particularly festive. Lord Blackwood had opened his best wines, and the conversation flowed freely. During the after-dinner port, which the ladies usually didn't attend, but Lady Blackwood had progressive notions about such things and invited everyone to remain, Lord Calloway suddenly stood, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The conversations died, attention turning to him. My friends, Calloway said, his voice carrying across the room with practiced ease, his smile broad and false as paint. I have wonderful news that I can no longer keep to myself. Lord Thornton has graciously accepted my suit for his daughter's hand. Lady Vivienne and I are to be engaged. Stunned silence. Vivienne felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and dizzy. Her father had agreed, without consulting her? He'd promised he wouldn't make any decisions without speaking to her first. Her hands gripped the table edge, knuckles white. Before she could respond, before she could find words through the roaring in her ears, Maximilian rose smoothly, his voice cutting across the room like a blade through silk. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Calloway. Lady Vivienne cannot accept your suit, as she and I have been developing an understanding of our own. Isn't that correct, my dear? All eyes swiveled to Vivienne. 24 pairs of eyes, watching, judging, waiting. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break her ribs. This was it, the point of no return, the moment that would define everything that came after. She thought of Eleanor's evidence, spread across the conservatory table, of Calloway's predatory smile and disappeared servants, of her father's desperation and her mother's fear, of Mrs. Mitchell dying in a workhouse while men like Maximilian called it progress. She stood, her legs somehow steady despite everything, and moved to Maximilian's side. His hand immediately found the small of her back, warm and solid and reassuring. Yes, she said, her voice clearer than she'd expected. The Duke and I have been getting acquainted. We intended to keep it private until we were certain of our feelings, but given the circumstances, silence seems impossible. The room exploded in shocked whispers, gasps, exclamations. Lady Blackwood looked positively delighted, as if she'd orchestrated the entire thing herself. Lady Cordelia's face was pale but composed, her expression unreadable. Calloway's expression turned murderous, all pretense of civility dropping away for one unguarded moment before he caught himself. This is very sudden, Your Grace, Calloway said, his voice tight as a drawn bowstring. Given that you publicly declared Lady Vivienne unfit for marriage mere weeks ago at the Worthington ball. Maximilian's smile was cold as winter, sharp as a knife. I've learned that first impressions can be deceiving, Calloway. Lady Vivienne has proven herself to be a woman of remarkable intellect and character, qualities I value far more than convenient agreement or simpering compliance. It was a public recantation of his earlier insult, and everyone in the room understood the significance. Calloway's hands clenched at his sides, rage barely contained. "Lord Thornton and I have a signed agreement. For a loan, nothing more," Maximilian interrupted smoothly, his voice carrying aristocratic authority that brooked no argument. "There is no legal engagement contract, as I understand it. Therefore, Lady Vivienne remains free to accept or reject suits as she chooses, and she has chosen." "Haven't you, my dear?" Vivienne met his eyes, saw the question there, saw him giving her one last chance to back out. "Yes, I've chosen." Calloway's face was a mask of barely controlled rage, fury, and calculation warring behind his eyes. He bowed stiffly, mechanically. "Forgive my presumption, I clearly misunderstood the situation. Congratulations to you both." He left the room with quick, angry strides, and the tension broke like a storm clearing. Guests surged forward with congratulations, questions, exclamations of surprise and delight. Vivienne felt Maximilian's hand on her back, proprietary, protective, warm through the silk of her gown. She leaned into it slightly, playing her part, but also drawing genuine comfort from his solid presence. As her eyes met his across the chaos, she saw a question there. "Are you all right?" She gave the tiniest nod. They were committed now, for better or worse. The game had truly begun. Late that night, Vivienne sat in her bedchamber, still dressed, unable to even think about sleep. A soft knock came at her door, and a servant delivered a folded note. She opened it with shaking hands. "Your father was not consulted about Calloway's announcement. He never signed an agreement. Calloway lied to force your hand. Be careful. He's more dangerous than we thought. E.B." Eleanor had been investigating too, using her father's connections. Vivienne's hands shook as she held the note over her bedside candle, watching the paper catch fire, curl, blacken to ash. Calloway was more dangerous than they'd thought, willing to lie outright, to manipulate, to trap her with public pressure. Thank God for Maximilian's intervention. Maximilian. When had she started thinking of him by his first name? Down the corridor, in his own chambers, Maximilian stood on his balcony despite the cold, despite the rain that had finally stopped, staring out at the moon-washed grounds. What had he done? He'd tied himself to a woman he barely knew, in a fake courtship that could explode into scandal at any moment, that could destroy both their reputations. And yet, when he'd seen Calloway's predatory triumph, when he'd seen Vivienne's pale, shocked face, he'd acted on pure instinct. Protection, possession, which was absurd. She wasn't his to protect or possess, except now, to all the world, she was. "What am I doing?" he asked the night, his breath fogging in the cold air. But somewhere deep in his chest, a traitorous voice whispered, "Exactly what you want." And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous truth of all. Chapter 5. The Performance and the Truth. Day 4. Morning. Morning brought sunlight after the rain, brilliant, almost defiant Yorkshire sunlight that transformed the sodden grounds into something jewel-like, each water droplet on grass and leaf catching light like diamonds. The house-party guests had only one full day remaining, and the overnight revelation of Vivienne and Maximilian's courtship was the sole topic of conversation, whispered over morning chocolate and discussed in urgent undertones in every corner of Blackwood Manor. At breakfast, they were expected to sit together, necessary behavior for a courting couple, unavoidable social theatre. Maximilian pulled out Vivienne's chair with perfect courtesy, his hand briefly touching her shoulder as she settled into the seat. She thanked him with a smile that almost looked natural, though her heart hammered nervously beneath her bodice. The entire breakfast table watched them with varying degrees of curiosity, speculation, and disapproval. "Well," Vivienne murmured once they were seated, and the general conversation had resumed around them, providing a slight buffer of noise, "we've certainly created a spectacle. I half expect someone to applaud our performance." "That was rather the point," Maximilian replied quietly, reaching for the silver teapot. He prepared her tea exactly as she preferred it, 1 sugar, a splash of cream, no lemon, which he'd somehow noticed during their breakfast puzzle competition 2 days ago. "How do you take your eggs?" "Scrambled, light on the salt." She paused, watching him signal to a footman with their breakfast preferences. "How did you know about my tea preference?" "I don't recall discussing it." "I pay attention." His grey eyes met hers with unexpected intensity. "We need to be convincing, Miss Thornton. That requires details. The way you take your tea, how you fold your napkin, which topics make you animated and which make you retreat into polite silence." Courtship is observation. Vivienne, she said impulsively, the name escaping before Prudence could stop it. If we're courting even falsely, you should use my given name. When we're alone, at least, or relatively alone. Vivienne. He tested the name slowly, carefully, as if tasting something rare and precious. Something about the way he said it soft, with that slight emphasis on the final syllable, made her pulse quicken traitorously. Then you should call me Maximilian, or Max, if you prefer. No one calls you Max. You could be the exception. It was said lightly, almost teasingly, but there was weight beneath it, layers of meaning she couldn't quite parse. Vivienne looked away, flustered, focusing intently on her teacup, as if the Earl Grey contained answers to questions she hadn't yet formed. This was pretense, she reminded herself. Strategic performance to protect her from Calloway and buy time for investigation. So why did it feel increasingly real with every passing moment? After breakfast, they were expected to walk the gardens together again, appropriate courtship behavior that would be remarked upon if neglected. Eleanor and Lady Cordelia joined them, providing both chaperonage and a buffer against the intensity that seemed to build whenever Vivienne and Maximilian were alone. The gardens were magnificent in autumn, all golden light and russet leaves. The paths, still damp from yesterday's rain, gleamed like polished stone. Lady Cordelia walked ahead with Eleanor, the two women engaged in animated discussion about something, music perhaps, or books, giving Vivienne and Maximilian a semblance of privacy while maintaining propriety. I spoke with Cordelia last night, Maximilian said quietly, his hands clasped behind his back as they walked. After dinner, before the announcement, she understood. There was never any formal arrangement between us, her aunt hoped, society assumed, but Cordelia herself had no particular expectations. She wished us well. She was very gracious this morning, Vivienne observed, thinking of how Lady Cordelia had squeezed her hand at breakfast and whispered, "Be happy." More gracious than I would have been in her position. I would have been tempted toward at least mild vindictiveness. Cordelia is genuinely kind, which is precisely why I couldn't marry her. I would have made her miserable. He paused, watching a robin hop along a branch overhead. She wants passion, adventure, romance, grand emotions. I would have given her duty and respect, and faithful companionship, but not what she deserves. She deserves better than comfortable affection. And what do you want? Vivienne asked before she could stop herself, the question escaping like a bird freed from captivity. Maximilian was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost vulnerable in a way she'd never heard from him. I want to matter, not because of my title or my wealth or my family name, but because of who I am. I want someone who sees me, truly sees me, past the duchy and the estates and the parliamentary seat, and doesn't flinch away from what they find. Someone who argues with me not because they want to change me into something more convenient, but because they believe I can be better than I am. The raw honesty in his voice stole her breath. Maximilian, your grace, Lady Vivienne. A footman in Blackwood livery hurried toward them along the gravel path, slightly out of breath. Lord Thornton has arrived. He's asking for his daughter immediately. Vivienne's stomach dropped precipitously, as if she'd missed a step on a staircase. Her father was here, and he must be furious, or confused, or both. She'd sent no word, explained nothing, and now he'd travelled all this way based on Lady Blackwood's message about an engagement that didn't truly exist. Lord Thornton had been shown to a private parlour, a small, elegant room done in blue silk, with windows overlooking the east garden. Vivienne entered with Maximilian at her side. She'd insisted he come, and he'd agreed without argument, his presence solid and reassuring. Her father looked haggard, older than his 52 years. His face was drawn with exhaustion from the journey and worry, new lines carved around his mouth and eyes. When he saw her, relief and anger warred visibly on his features. "Vivienne, thank God you're safe. I came as soon as I received Lady Blackwood's message about..." His gaze shifted to Maximilian, wariness overtaking other emotions. "Your Grace," Maximilian bowed with perfect correctness. "Lord Thornton, I believe congratulations are in order, are they?" Her father's voice was tight, stretched thin as worn cloth. "I know nothing of this courtship. Yesterday morning I received a message from Lord Calloway, claiming Vivienne had accepted his suit and we should prepare for an engagement announcement. This morning I received a message from Lady Blackwood saying my daughter was courting the Duke of Westmere. What in God's name is happening? Has the entire world gone mad? Papa, I never accepted Lord Calloway's suit, Vivienne said firmly, moving closer to her father. He lied. There was no agreement, no understanding. He fabricated the entire thing to force my hand publicly. But our debts, Vivienne, he bought them, all of them. If you refuse him, he'll call them in immediately, and we'll lose everything. The house, the land, everything your grandfather and his father built will be ruined, destroyed. Which is exactly why Lord Calloway is an unsuitable match, Maximilian interjected, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. He's using financial coercion to force a marriage. That's not courtship, Lord Thornton. That's blackmail, and it's beneath contempt. Lord Thornton sank into a chair as if his legs could no longer support him, suddenly looking broken, diminished. Then what am I to do? We're ruined. I've failed you, failed your mother, failed everyone. No, sir. You're not ruined. Maximilian produced a document from his coat pocket, thick parchment, with an impressive seal, clearly prepared by solicitors. This arrived by express messenger this morning. It's a formal loan agreement. My bank will purchase your debts from Calloway at a reduced rate, which he'll be forced to accept because he's desperate for immediate capital to satisfy his own creditors. You'll repay the loan on reasonable terms over 15 years, secured against your estate but with no threat of foreclosure except in cases of complete default. Your home is safe, your honor intact, your daughter free to make her own choices. Vivienne stared at him, genuinely shocked. You did this? When? You were with me all evening, and this morning. I sent instructions to my solicitor last night after dinner, after Calloway's performance made his tactics abundantly clear. Maximilian looked distinctly uncomfortable under her scrutiny, as if generosity embarrassed him more than cruelty ever could. It's business, nothing more. A sound investment with excellent security. It's not nothing, Vivienne whispered, emotion tightening her throat. It's everything. Lord Thornton read the document with shaking hands, his lips moving silently as he processed the terms. This is extraordinarily generous, Your Grace. The interest rate is half what any bank would charge, the repayment schedule more than fair. But I don't understand. Why would you involve yourself so deeply in our affairs? Why take such risks unless— He looked up sharply, hope and confusion mingling. Unless you truly intend to marry my daughter? Silence fell, heavy and weighted with meaning. This was the question they'd been avoiding, the lie they'd been dancing around. The Duke and I have developed an understanding, Vivienne said carefully, choosing each word as if navigating a minefield. It's early days yet, but there is genuine regard between us. But I have every intention of courting your daughter properly, Maximilian finished smoothly, the lie, if it was still a lie, coming without hesitation. With your permission and blessing, of course. I won't proceed without your consent. Vivienne searched his face for signs of pretense, for the performance she knew this was supposed to be. But his expression was serious, sincere, almost earnest in a way she'd never seen from him. Lord Thornton looked between them, confusion giving way slowly to cautious hope. You're serious? After your public statement at the Worthington ball about her unsuitability? The entire county heard you call her unfit to be anyone's wife. I was wrong, Maximilian said simply, meeting the older man's eyes directly. Your daughter is extraordinary, Lord Thornton. She challenged me to be better, to think beyond my own narrow perspective, and I'm learning that's exactly what I need, what I've always needed but was too proud to recognize. Vivienne's chest tightened painfully. Was he still performing for her father's benefit, or did he mean it? After Lord Thornton left cautiously optimistic, promising to review the loan documents with his own solicitor and to discuss everything with Lady Catherine, Vivienne needed air, needed space to think, needed anything but the confines of Blackwood Manor's elegant rooms. She escaped to the Garden Folly, a small classical temple at the edge of the ornamental pond, its white marble columns reflected in water, still as glass. She stood at the marble balustrade, staring at her own distorted reflection, trying to understand what was happening to her carefully ordered world. She heard his footsteps on the marble steps, knew without looking that it was Maximilian. She'd become attuned to him somehow, could recognize the cadence of his walk, the particular quality of his presence. You didn't have to say all that, Vivienne said without turning around. Not to my father. The loan agreement was more than enough. You didn't need to pretend genuine interest, genuine feelings. he would have accepted the arrangement based solely on financial necessity. I meant what I said. He came to stand beside her at the balustrade, close but not touching, both of them staring at the water. All of it. Did you? She finally turned to face him, searching his expression for truth. Because I'm confused, Maximilian. Is this still pretense? Are we still playing roles to fool Calloway and protect my family? Or has something changed between us? I need to know which performance I'm in. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if words fought to escape, but couldn't quite find their way. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost vulnerable, stripped of aristocratic certainty. I don't know. I've spent weeks trying to dismiss you from my thoughts, trying to convince myself that what I feel is merely guilt over the Mitchells, or wounded pride over your public challenge, or simple physical attraction that will fade with familiarity. You're inappropriate by every social measure, opinionated in ways that make other men uncomfortable, stubborn to the point of mule-headed absurdity. This is quite the romantic speech, Vivienne interrupted dryly, though her heart was racing. Truly, you should publish a guide to courtship, how to woo a lady by cataloguing her faults. But you're also brilliant in ways that make my carefully constructed arguments crumble, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, urgency entering his voice. Passionate about justice in ways I've forgotten how to be, and braver than anyone I've ever met, braver than soldiers I've known, braver certainly than I am. You don't care about my title. You don't want my wealth or my influence. You look at me and see a man who needs to do better, who can do better, and somehow that's... He struggled for words, his control fracturing. That's more intoxicating than any amount of flattery or fawning could ever be. Vivienne's breath caught in her throat. Maximilian, I'm not good at this, he said, almost helplessly, turning to face her fully. I don't know the pretty words, the poetic declarations. I only know that when Calloway announced his intention to marry you, when I saw your face go white with shock and horror, I felt like someone had struck me in the chest with a hammer. The thought of you trapped with that predator, of you being hurt or diminished or destroyed. His hands clenched at his sides. I couldn't bear it. Can't bear it. He turned to her fully now, and the intensity in his grey eyes made her dizzy, made the gardens spin around them. I can't promise this isn't still partly pretense, he said quietly, honestly. I can't promise I won't hurt you or disappoint you or fail to be the man you need and deserve. God knows I'm far from perfect, I'm arrogant and stubborn, and I've spent 32 years believing my own superiority. But I can promise that this, he gestured between them, that charged space that seemed to pulse with its own energy. Whatever this is, it's become real for me. Perhaps it's been real since the library, since you challenged me to examine my own comfortable assumptions, perhaps longer. Perhaps since you stood in that ballroom and refused to bow to me. Vivienne should be cautious, careful. Protect her heart the way she'd learned to protect everything else with walls and wit and careful distance. Instead, she heard herself whisper, "It's real for me too." And that terrifies me more than Calloway, more than ruin, more than anything. Good, he said with a ghost of a smile, something almost boyish flickering across his usually controlled features. I'd hate to be terrified alone. Seems only fair we should face this particular madness together. They were standing very close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker grey in his eyes like storm clouds, the slight shadow of beard along his jaw despite his morning shave, the way his throat moved when he swallowed. His hand rose slowly, hesitating near her face as if afraid she might flinch away. "May I?" he asked quietly, giving her every opportunity to refuse. She nodded, not trusting her voice, barely trusting herself. His fingers brushed her cheek so gentle it almost hurt, a tenderness she hadn't known he possessed. Then they traced along her jaw to tilt her face up toward his touch reverent, questioning. "I'm going to kiss you now," he murmured, his breath warm against her lips. "And it won't be for show. It won't be strategy or performance. It will be because I can't go another moment without knowing what you taste like, without knowing if this feeling between us is real or just the most elaborate self-deception I've ever constructed." "Yes," she breathed, the word barely audible. "Yes." His lips met hers, soft at first, questioning, almost tentative. Vivienne rose on her toes, her hands finding his shoulders, solid and warm beneath his coat, and the kiss deepened. It was nothing like the chaste courtship kisses she'd read about in novels, nothing like the careful pecks exchanged at wedding ceremonies. It was heat and hunger and something almost desperate, as if they were both drowning and had found unexpected air. His arms came around her waist, pulling her closer, and she melted into him, into this impossible moment that felt more real than anything in her carefully controlled life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, hearts racing in tandem, Maximilian rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Well," he said raggedly, his voice rough with emotion. "That was—" "Yes," she managed, equally breathless. "Quite. We should probably return to the house, before we're missed, before this becomes even more scandalous than it already is." "Probably." Neither moved, neither willing to break this moment, this bubble of possibility. Finally, Vivienne stepped back, her fingers rising involuntarily to touch her lips, still tingling from his kiss. "This complicates everything, you realize. Everything we planned." "I know. Calloway will be furious when he learns about the loan. When he realizes we've outmaneuvered him, he'll retaliate somehow. Men like him always do." "I know that too. And your uncle, Lord Pemberton, he'll be appalled that you're courting an impoverished woman with a scandalous reputation instead of someone like Lady Cordelia. He'll make your life difficult." "Almost certainly." Maximilian reached out, taking her hand in his thumb tracing circles on her palm that sent shivers up her arm. "Are you trying to talk me out of this, listing all the reasons this is foolish and impossible?" "I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're risking. Your family's approval, society's good opinion, your political prospects, all of it could be damaged by association with me." "I understand perfectly." His grip tightened slightly, warm and reassuring. "You're worth the risk, Vivienne. All of it, every possible consequence." For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, perhaps years, Vivienne felt something bloom in her chest that might be hope. Fragile, terrifying hope. That evening, as the house party began its final wind-down, as guests prepared for departure the following morning, Vivienne returned to her bedchamber to find a note that had been slipped under her door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful copperplate that could have belonged to anyone with education. But the message was crystal clear. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts. The Duke will tire of you soon enough. You're a novelty, nothing more, a social experiment to assuage his guilty conscience. And when he does tire of you, when he returns to his proper sphere and you're left with nothing but broken promises, I'll be waiting. Your family's debts may be temporarily resolved, but I have other means of persuasion. Watch yourself, Lady Vivienne, and watch your mother. She walks alone in the gardens often, doesn't she? Morning constitutionals are so healthful until they're not. Accidents happen so easily, especially to women of a certain age with uncertain footing. No signature." But Vivienne knew exactly who had sent it, could hear Calloway's voice in every threatening word. Her hands shook as she held the note over her bedside candle, watching the paper catch fire, curl, blacken to ash in the porcelain dish. Calloway wasn't finished. The game hadn't ended, it had merely entered a more dangerous phase. And now her mother was at risk. She needed to tell Maximilian, immediately. But as she started toward the door, hand on the knob, she realized with sudden clarity, she was now completely dependent on him. When had that happened? When had she shifted from proud independence to this new state, where her safety, her family's security, even her mother's life, might rest on his continued protection? The thought should frighten her more than it did. The thought should send her running in the opposite direction. Instead, she found herself moving down the corridor toward his chambers, the burned note's ashes still clinging to her fingers like a warning she couldn't quite heed. Chapter 6. Exposure and Escalation. 1 week later, Thornton Manor. The week following the Blackwood house party felt simultaneously endless and far too brief. Vivienne and her mother had returned to Thornton Manor, while Maximilian departed for London to oversee the complex financial arrangements of the debt transfer and to meet with his investigator. The separation felt strange, unnatural, even in ways Vivienne hadn't anticipated. She'd grown accustomed to his presence over those few intense days, his steady confidence, the way his eyes found hers across crowded rooms, the particular timbre of his voice when he said her name. She hadn't told anyone about Calloway's threatening note. Not Eleanor, despite their friendship and Eleanor's own investigations. Not her parents, who had enough worries without adding to them, and despite her better judgment, despite knowing it was foolish, not Maximilian, who would certainly have insisted on immediate action. She told herself she didn't want to worry him unnecessarily, that the threat was likely empty bluster from a wounded man lashing out in impotent rage. But she didn't quite believe her own reassurances. So she watched her mother like a hawk, ensuring Lady Catherine was never alone. Morning walks were undertaken together. Garden visits became joint expeditions. Even trips to the village required Vivian's company, much to her mother's bemused confusion. "Darling, you needn't hover so," Lady Catherine said gently one afternoon as they returned from calling on the vicar's wife. "I'm not an invalid. I know, Mama. I simply enjoy your company." It wasn't entirely a lie. Eleanor visited daily, bringing news and moral support with the regularity of the Morning Post. On the 5th day of Maximilian's absence, she arrived with her usual basket of provisions. The Bennets' cook had taken pity on the Thorntons' reduced circumstances and an expression that suggested particularly juicy gossip. "The whole county is talking about you and the Duke," Eleanor announced, settling into the morning room's least worn chair. "Half of Greystoke thinks it's wildly romantic, a love match between the proud Duke and the woman who challenged him. The other half thinks you've somehow entrapped him, that you used feminine wiles or your father's desperation to force an advantageous match." "Wonderful," Vivienne muttered, setting aside the agricultural journal she'd been reading without comprehension. "And which half is winning? Hard to say, though I will tell you that Lady Pemberton Maximilian's aunt is reportedly scandalized. She's been telling anyone who'll listen that you're completely unsuitable, that the Duke has taken leave of his senses, and that she's washing her hands of the entire affair. At least someone in his family has sense. There's more." Eleanor's expression turned serious. "Calloway has left Greystoke. No one knows where he's gone, but his servants say he departed 3 days ago in a fury, taking very little with him, just a single bag and his riding horse. He left most of his belongings, even valuable items. This should have been reassuring, the predator departing, the threat receding. Instead, Vivian felt a chill of foreboding settle in her bones like winter cold. "A man with nothing to lose is more dangerous than one with everything to protect," she said quietly. Eleanor squeezed her hand. "Maximilian returns tomorrow. He sent word this morning. Tomorrow felt both too soon and impossibly distant. London, Maximilian's club." Maximilian sat in a private room at White's, the gentleman's club that had been his refuge during difficult times since his Oxford days. The room was panelled in dark wood, smelled of leather and tobacco and old money, and was blessedly free of curious eyes and listening ears. James Webster sat across from him, a former Bow Street runner with the build of a prizefighter and the mind of a chess master. Webster had made his reputation on discretion and thoroughness, qualities Maximilian had come to appreciate deeply over the past week of intensive investigation. "I found one of them," Webster announced without preamble, setting a leather folder on the table between them. "The missing maid from Calloway's Hampshire estate, Sarah Collins. She's alive, living under the assumed name Sarah Miller in Bristol, working as a seamstress." Relief flooded through Maximilian like water breaking through a dam. "Thank God. Will she testify?" Webster's expression turned grim. "She's terrified, Your Grace. Calloway paid her £50 a fortune for a maid to disappear and keep silent about what she witnessed. She won't tell me specifics, not yet, but she has nightmares. Wakes screaming, according to her landlady. Whatever she saw has broken something in her." Maximilian's hands clenched on the chair arms. "Can we protect her? Offer her more money, security, a new life somewhere Calloway can't reach? We can try, but there's something else." Webster opened the folder, revealing pages of cramped handwriting. "She did tell me about the other missing woman, Margaret Price, the tenant's daughter. According to Collins, Miss Price became pregnant. Calloway's child, no question about paternity. The girl was 16, sir. 16. Maximilian felt something cold and violent move through his chest. "And Miss Price disappeared shortly after she began showing. Collins says the girl was preparing to blackmail. Calloway thought he'd marry her to avoid scandal or at least provide handsomely for the child. She was naive, poor thing. Didn't understand the kind of man she was dealing with. Calloway had her killed. It wasn't a question. Collins believes so, though she has no proof. No body has ever been found. The family reported her missing, but the magistrate who owes Calloway gambling debts," Maximilian finished bitterly, "did nothing." "Precisely. The case was closed within a week. Runaway daughter, moral failing, good riddance. That was the official verdict." "Christ!" Maximilian ran both hands through his hair, not caring that he was destroying his careful styling. "Can we prove any of this?" "Not without Margaret Price's body, and I've had men searching. Nothing yet. But I did find something else. Webster produced a ledger, its pages covered in numbers and calculations. Calloway's gambling debts are even worse than our initial estimates. He owes nearly £20,000 to a moneylender named Silas Crow, a man who operates on the darkest edges of legality. Crow's collection methods are notorious, Your Grace. Men who can't pay him often turn up in the Thames with their throats cut, ruled as suicides or accidents. How much time does Calloway have? According to my sources in London's gambling dens, Crow gave him until month's end to produce full payment. That's less than 3 weeks from today. Understanding crystallized like ice forming on glass. Which is why Calloway was so desperate to marry Miss Thornton. Her family's properties, once consolidated with his through marriage, could be mortgaged to raise the capital he needs. Precisely, Your Grace. And now that option is closed to him, thanks to your intervention. He'll be desperate, Maximilian said grimly. And desperate men are the most dangerous kind. Webster's expression suggested he understood exactly what that meant. I've taken the liberty of hiring additional men to watch Thornton Manor, discreetly, of course. But if Calloway makes a move against Miss Thornton or her family, thank you. Maximilian felt gratitude mixed with worry. I return to Greystoke tomorrow. Keep me informed of any developments. After Webster left, Maximilian sat alone in the private room, staring at the evidence spread before him. Somewhere out there, Calloway was planning his next move, and Vivienne, brilliant, stubborn, brave Vivienne, was refusing to take the threat seriously enough. He needed to return to her. Now, the Greystoke Assembly. The monthly assembly at Greystoke's town hall was a more modest affair than the Worthington ball, fewer guests, less elaborate decorations, a smaller orchestra but still well attended by local society. Vivienne's mother had insisted attendance was crucial to establish Vivienne's new status, as the Dukes intended, to show society that the match was real and progressing appropriately. Maximilian had returned from London that morning, looking tired but determined. He'd called at Thornton Manor with perfect formality, presenting flowers to Lady Catherine and requesting the honour of escorting Vivienne to the evening's assembly. Now they entered the town hall together, his hand warm and solid at her elbow, presenting a united front to Greystoke's assembled gentry. The whispers began immediately, a susurration like wind through autumn leaves. She's wearing new gloves, kid leather, French by the look of them. Did the Duke buy them? Look at how he's watching her, like she's the only woman in the room. I heard Lord Pemberton refuse to receive her, cut the Duke dead when he mentioned the courtship. Well, I think it's romantic. A proper love match, not some arranged affair for bloodlines and money. The assembly hall was decorated with autumn branches and late-blooming chrysanthemums. Candles glowed in sconces along the walls, and the small orchestra was tuning their instruments for the evening's dancing. They danced the first waltz, mandatory for a courting couple, expected by all present. Vivienne had never waltzed with Maximilian in public before, and she discovered he was an excellent dancer, leading with confidence and precision that made her feel graceful despite her nervousness. "You're tense," he murmured as they turned, his hand firm at her waist. "I can feel it in your shoulders. Everyone is staring. I can feel their eyes like physical touches. Let them stare. You look beautiful tonight." His voice was low, intimate, meant only for her. She did look well. Her mother had insisted on purchasing a new gown with some of the money Lord Thornton had received as an advance against the new loan. Pale blue silk that brought out the violet in her eyes, with delicate embroidery at the bodice and sleeves. It was the finest thing she'd worn in years. Maximilian's compliment made warmth spread through her chest, chasing away some of the anxiety. "You received information in London," she said quietly, reading the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. "I can see it in your face. What did you learn?" "Later. Not here." His hand tightened fractionally on her waist. "Have you been well this week? Any incidents? Anything unusual?" She thought of the threatening note, of the ashes she'd scattered from her window, of watching her mother constantly. Nothing worth mentioning. His grey eyes narrowed, studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. "Vivienne, tell me the truth." "Later," she echoed his earlier words. "Not here." The music ended, and the assembled guests applauded politely. Maximilian was leading Vivienne toward the refreshment table. She was desperately thirsty from the exertion and anxiety of dancing when the assembly hall's main doors burst open with dramatic, terrible force. Lord Henry Calloway stood in the doorway like an avenging fury. He was dishevelled and wild-eyed, a far cry from his usual urbane polish. His cravat hung askew, his coat was rumpled and stained with what might have been mud or worse, and there was a desperate, manic energy about him that made Vivienne's blood run cold as winter water. The room fell into shocked silence. The orchestra's final notes died away discordantly. "There he is," Calloway's voice rang out across the assembly hall, slightly slurred. He'd been drinking heavily, by the sound of it. The noble Duke of Westmere, stealing another man's betrothed. The great reformer, the champion of the downtrodden, revealed as nothing more than a thief. Maximilian stepped in front of Vivienne immediately, instinctively, his body a shield. "Calloway, you're drunk. Leave now before you embarrass yourself further and make this situation worse than it already is." "Embarrass myself?" Calloway laughed, a bitter, broken sound that held no humor whatsoever. He advanced into the room, and guests scattered before him like sheep before a wolf, pressing themselves against the walls. "You've ruined me, Radcliffe, bought up my debts at a fraction of their value, poisoned society against me with your investigations and whispers, stolen the woman I intended to marry, all because you couldn't bear that someone else would have her first. This is about your pride, not her welfare. I prevented you from trapping an innocent woman through financial coercion," Maximilian said coldly, each word precisely enunciated. "There's a substantial difference between courtship and blackmail, Calloway. You seem to have confused the two. Innocent?" Calloway's gaze swung to Vivienne with ugly, vindictive intensity. "Is she, though? A woman who'd throw herself at a duke to escape her family's debts? A woman who'd use her feminine charms to manipulate a wealthy man into saving her from ruin? That sounds rather mercenary to me. That sounds like a fortune hunter." Vivienne felt the accusation like a physical slap, heat flooding her face. Around them, guests murmured, some shocked, some intrigued, all watching avidly, as if this were theatre rather than real lives unraveling. Maximilian's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet that somehow carried better than shouting, "Apologize to Lady Vivienne, now, or I will make you regret every word." "Or what? You'll challenge me to a duel?" Calloway laughed again, pulling a folded paper from his coat with the flourish of a stage magician. "How delightfully medieval, how perfectly aristocratic. Perhaps the Assembly would prefer to hear about your real reasons for courting Lady Vivienne. Shall I read from the investigative report your man compiled on me, the one that mentions my financial troubles, my first wife's unfortunate death, the 2 missing servants from my Hampshire estate?" Shock rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Maximilian's jaw tightened visibly, but he said nothing. "Yes, I know about your investigation," Calloway continued, his voice rising to something near hysteria. "Did you think I wouldn't have you investigated in return? Did you think I'd simply accept defeat? I know the truth, Radcliffe. You're courting her out of pity and guilt, nothing more. You're using her to salve your aristocratic conscience over those displaced tenant farmers she lectured you about. She's your act of public charity, your visible penance. And when you tire of the novelty, when society forgets about your momentary compassion, you'll discard her like yesterday's newspaper." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Vivienne felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and dizzy. Was there truth in this? Had everything been performance, guilt-driven theatre? "That's quite enough." A new voice cut through the charged atmosphere. Eleanor stepped forward, her solicitor father beside her, both of them wearing expressions of grim determination. "Lord Calloway, you're making serious allegations in a public forum. Do you have actual proof of these claims?" "Proof?" Calloway waved the paper triumphantly. "It's all documented here, the investigation, the findings, the Duke's guilty motivations. Then you won't mind submitting those documents to proper legal review," Mr. Bennet said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority. "As an officer of the court, I'm prepared to examine any evidence of wrongdoing or impropriety, including, naturally, evidence related to your own activities and business practices." Calloway's face went white, then red, then white again. "What are you implying, Bennet?" "I'm implying nothing whatsoever." Mr. Bennet's voice remained perfectly steady, maddeningly calm. "I'm stating facts. I've been in correspondence with magistrates in Hampshire regarding irregularities in several investigations under their jurisdiction. Most notably, the circumstances surrounding your first wife's death and the unexplained disappearances of 2 women previously in your employ, Sarah Collins and Margaret Price. Perhaps you'd care to address those matters while we're all gathered here." The room exploded in shocked whispers, gasps, exclamations of horror and fascination. "You have no authority to investigate me," Calloway's voice cracked. "You're a provincial solicitor, nothing more. Actually, as of yesterday afternoon, I have quite specific authority." Mr. Bennet produced his own document, official, sealed, impressive. "I've been appointed special investigator by the Lord Chancellor's office to review these particular matters. The investigation will be thorough, Lord Calloway, and it cannot be blocked by local magistrates who have, shall we say, financial entanglements with the subjects under investigation." Calloway realized, visibly, that he was trapped. His desperate gambit to destroy Maximilian and Vivian's reputations had backfired spectacularly, publicly, irreversibly. "This isn't over," he snarled, his face contorted with rage and something like fear. "You think you've won? You think this ends here? You don't know what I'm capable of, Radcliffe. You don't know how far I'll go." "Is that a threat, Lord Calloway?" Maximilian's voice was ice and iron. "Made publicly, in front of 50 witnesses? Please, do continue. I'm certain the magistrate would be fascinated to hear you threaten violence." 2 constables entered the hall, summoned by Mr. Bennet earlier. Vivian realized with sudden clarity. This confrontation had been anticipated, prepared for. Stage managed to expose Calloway completely. "Lord Calloway," one constable said with formal courtesy, "you're requested to accompany us to answer questions regarding certain matters in Hampshire. Matters of a serious nature that require immediate clarification." "You can't arrest me." Calloway's voice rose to a near shriek. "I'm a peer of the realm. I have rights, privileges." "We're not arresting you, my lord," the second constable said calmly. "We're inviting you to assist with official inquiries, voluntarily, of course. Though refusing such an invitation would appear somewhat suspicious, wouldn't it? Might suggest you have something to hide." Calloway's wild gaze swept the assembly, taking in the fascinated horror on every face. The judgment, the condemnation, the social death he'd just inflicted upon himself. He'd lost everything in the space of minutes, destroyed himself trying to destroy others. "This is your doing," he spat at Maximilian, spittle flying. "You orchestrated all of this. The investigation, the documents, this public humiliation. I simply provided accurate information to the proper authorities," Maximilian said with devastating calm. "What they chose to do with that information is entirely their concern, not mine. I merely fulfilled my duty as a citizen and a gentleman." As the constables moved to escort Calloway out, each taking an arm as he continued protesting, threatening, unraveling publicly, Vivian felt Maximilian's hand find hers beneath the cover of her skirts and squeeze gently, reassuringly. "Are you all right?" he murmured, his lips barely moving. She nodded, though she was shaking like a leaf in high wind. "Was any of it true? What he said about your motives, about guilt and penance?" His face tightened with something that looked like pain. "We need to talk, privately. There are things I need to tell you, truths you deserve to hear." They escaped to the Assembly Hall's small terrace, barely more than a balcony, overlooking the street, while Eleanor and Mr. Bennet kept watch to ensure propriety and privacy. The November night was cold, and Vivienne had no wrap, but she barely felt it. Her entire focus was on Maximilian's face, on the truth she was about to hear. "Tell me," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "All of it. No more protection, no more careful omissions. I need the complete truth." Maximilian leaned against the stone balustrade, his face illuminated by light spilling from the assembly hall windows. When he spoke, his voice was raw with honesty, stripped of its usual aristocratic polish. "Initially, yes, my interest in you was born partly from guilt. Your words about the Mitchell family haunted me, kept me awake at night, made me question assumptions I'd held for years. I wanted to prove to myself, and to you, that I wasn't the monster you believed me to be at the Worthington ball. So I investigated Calloway, offered the loan to your father, positioned myself as your protector. I played the hero because I needed to believe I could be one." Each word landed like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples Vivienne could feel in her chest. The truth hurt, but lies would have hurt worse. "But that's not why I kissed you in the garden, Folly," he continued, his eyes meeting hers directly, unflinchingly. "That's not why I spent 3 sleepless nights in London, desperate to return to you, checking my watch every hour like a lovesick boy. That's not why the thought of Calloway anywhere near you made me want to commit murder despite being a supposedly civilized man. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, intimate and desperate. What began as guilt became something else entirely. You challenged me in ways no one ever has, fascinated me with your intelligence and passion, infuriated me with your stubborn refusal to bow to authority, and somewhere in all of that chaos and confusion, I fell in love with you. Not because you're a charity case, or my penance, or my public redemption, because you're brilliant and brave and you make me want to be worthy of you. You make me want to be the man you believed I could be when you challenged me in that ballroom. Vivian's breath caught painfully in her throat. You love me? Desperately, inconveniently, completely. A rueful smile touched his lips, transforming his usually stern features. I realize the timing is appalling, given what just transpired with Calloway, but I can't let his poison fester between us, can't let doubt take root. So yes, Vivian Thornton, I love you. And if you can't return those feelings because of how this began, because guilt tainted the start of something real, I'll understand. But I needed you to know the truth, whatever it costs me. Tears blurred Vivian's vision, tears of relief, of joy, of overwhelming emotion she couldn't quite name. You impossible, frustrating, wonderful man. Is that a yes or a no? His voice held the faintest tremor of uncertainty. It's an, I love you too, you frustrating, complicated, occasionally infuriating person. She closed the distance between them, her hands finding his face, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slight roughness of evening beard. It's an, I should probably hate you for your aristocratic guilt complex and your need to be everyone's savior, but I can't because you're genuine about it, because you actually change and grow. It's an, I'm terrified and furious and completely, hopelessly in love with you despite every reasonable objection. His arms came around her waist, pulling her close against him, and she felt his heart hammering against her chest, as rapid and uncertain as her own. That might be the least romantic declaration of love I've ever heard. Then we're perfectly matched, because yours wasn't exactly Shakespearean poetry either. He laughed, a genuine, surprised sound that seemed to startle him as much as it delighted her, and kissed her. This kiss was different from the one in the garden folly at Blackwood Manor, softer somehow, deeper, weighted with confession and forgiveness and promise. It tasted of truth and hope and terrifying possibility. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vivian said seriously, We still have enormous problems to address. Your family will oppose this match, your uncle has already made that clear. Society will gossip endlessly about your motives and mine. And Calloway, she shivered, remembering his wild eyes, his desperate threats. He's wounded but not destroyed, cornered but not captured. Desperate men do desperate, dangerous things. I know. Maximilian's hand cupped her cheek gently. But we'll face it together, as partners, as equals. I won't make decisions about your safety or your life without consulting you. As partners, she echoed, warming to the word, to the promise it contained. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her father behind her, both wearing grim expressions that immediately raised Vivian's alarm. I hate to interrupt, Eleanor said quietly, but there's news, important news. Mr. Bennet stepped forward, his professional composure cracking slightly to reveal worry beneath. The constables just informed me that Calloway slipped away from them. He claimed he needed to retrieve crucial documents from his lodgings to prove his innocence, and, in the confusion of the street, he gave them the slip. They're searching for him now throughout Greystoke, but in the darkness, in his current state of desperation. But he's desperate and has nothing left to lose. Maximilian finished grimly, his voice flat with certainty. His arm tightened protectively around Vivian. We need to get you and your mother somewhere safe immediately. I'm not hiding in fear, Vivian protested, her pride rebelling against the idea. I won't let him turn me into a prisoner. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to be sensible, to recognize genuine danger. Maximilian's voice was strained with barely controlled fear. Until Calloway is apprehended. A scream cut through the night air, high and terrible. From inside the assembly hall, someone shouted, Fire! There's a fire in the street. The carriages are burning. They rushed to the front of the building, pushing through confused, frightened guests. Orange flames were engulfing a carriage outside the Thornton carriage, Vivian realized with horror. The fire was intense, deliberately set, spreading rapidly. Mama! Vivian's heart stopped. ice flooding her veins. "Where's my mother? Has anyone seen Lady Catherine?" "She went to lie down in the ladies' retiring room," Eleanor said urgently, grabbing Vivienne's arm. "About 20 minutes ago. Said she had a terrible headache from all the excitement." They raced back inside, pushing through the panicked crowd, now fleeing toward the exits. The retiring room was on the ground floor, near the street entrance, perilously close to where the carriage fire burned with unnatural intensity. Smoke was already seeping under the door like malevolent fog. Maximilian reached the door first, tried the handle with desperate urgency. "It's locked! From the outside." Someone locked it deliberately. Pure terror flooded Vivienne's body, adrenaline making everything sharp and clear and impossibly slow. "Mama, Mama, can you hear me?" Lady Catherine's voice came through the door, muffled and frightened, but blessedly alive. "Vivienne, Vivienne, I can't open the door. Something's blocking it from outside. I can smell smoke." Maximilian didn't hesitate, didn't waste time with further attempts at the handle. He threw his considerable weight against the door, once, twice, grunting with effort. On the third impact, the wood splintered and gave way. Furniture had been piled against it from the outside chairs. A small table, deliberately barricading Lady Catherine inside. They pulled her out just as flames began licking hungrily at the retiring room's curtains, smoke billowing in choking clouds. Outside, the fire brigade arrived with clanging bells, men shouting orders, chaos of water and smoke and fear. Lady Catherine coughed violently, clutching Vivienne with shaking hands. Her face was pale as death, her eyes wide with shock. "A man there was a man who came to me during the assembly. He said someone wanted to speak with me privately, that it was important, concerning Vivienne. He seemed respectable, concerned. He led me to the retiring room, and then I heard the door lock, heard furniture scraping, and I couldn't get out. I couldn't see his face clearly in the dim light, but his voice." "Calloway," Maximilian said grimly, certainty in his voice. "He tried to make good on his threat. The note you received, Vivienne, he wasn't bluffing." Vivienne's rage was incandescent, burning hotter than the flames being doused by the fire brigade. "He tried to murder my mother. He tried to kill her." "He tried to kill you both," Eleanor corrected quietly, pointing to the still burning carriage wreckage. "You would have left in that carriage after the assembly. The fire would have spread from there to the building while you were retrieving your mother. If she'd been trapped in that room much longer, if the smoke had been thicker. She didn't finish. She didn't need to." Vivienne understood perfectly. Calloway had planned a double murder trap her mother, burn the carriage, let chaos and smoke and fire do his work while he disappeared into the night. It was calculated, monstrous, and it had nearly worked. The fire was eventually contained through the heroic efforts of Greystoke's volunteer fire brigade. The damage limited to the Thornton carriage destroyed completely, and one wall of the assembly hall. No one else had been hurt, but the shock rippled through Greystoke like an earthquake's aftershocks. Maximilian refused to leave Vivienne's side, his protective instinct overriding all social convention. He insisted, demanded, really, brooking no argument, that the Thornton women stay at Radcliffe Hall under his direct protection, with his guards, until Calloway was apprehended. Lord Thornton, arriving at the scene just as the fire was being extinguished, agreed immediately, too shaken to raise objections about propriety. As dawn broke over Radcliffe Hall, painting the Yorkshire countryside in shades of pink and gold, Vivienne stood at the window of her guest chamber, a beautiful room done in rose and cream that would have delighted her under different circumstances. She was still wearing her singed ball gown, unable to think about changing, unable to think about anything except how close she'd come to losing her mother. Maximilian found her there. He was equally disheveled, his coat discarded, his shirt stained with smoke and effort. Neither of them had slept, neither could. "I should never have let him walk away from that assembly hall," Maximilian said quietly, standing beside her at the window. "I should have had the constables arrest him immediately, consequences be damned." "On what legal grounds?" "At that point, we had suspicions and investigations, not proof of actual crimes." Vivienne turned to face him. "This isn't your fault, Maximilian. The blame belongs entirely to Calloway. He's targeting you because of me, because I interfered in his plans, because I exposed his secrets. He's targeting me because I'm a convenient victim, and he's a monster who sees women as property to be acquired or destroyed. That's not the same thing as this being your fault." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "But this does change everything. I won't pretend otherwise. As long as Calloway is free and desperate, everyone around me is in mortal danger. Which is why you're staying here, under guard, until he's found and arrested. I can't live in a cage, Maximilian. Even a gilded one. I'm not asking you to live in a cage. His voice broke slightly, control fracturing to reveal raw fear beneath. I'm asking you to let me protect you, to let me keep you safe. I can't lose you, Vivienne. Not when I've just found you. Not when I've just discovered what it means to love someone more than duty or honor or pride. Vivienne rose on her toes and kissed him gently, tasting smoke and fear and desperate love. You won't lose me. I'm rather difficult to get rid of permanently, in case you hadn't noticed. I'm stubborn that way. I've noticed. His arms came around her, holding her as if she might disappear. It's one of the many, many reasons I love you. Outside the door, Eleanor kept faithful watch, ensuring propriety even in crisis. Mr. Bennet had departed to coordinate with the constabulary and magistrates. Lord Thornton paced in the library, alternating between fury at Calloway and overwhelming gratitude to Maximilian. And somewhere in the Yorkshire countryside, Lord Henry Calloway ran hunted, desperate, dangerous, and utterly without hope or mercy. The game had become deadly. The stakes were life and death now, not merely reputation and fortune. But Vivienne and Maximilian were no longer playing alone. They had allies, evidence, love, and each other. The question that remained, hanging in the air like smoke, would it be enough? Chapter 7. The Reckoning and the Proposal. Radcliffe Hall had become a fortress in all but name. Armed guards patrolled the grounds in shifts, their boots crunching on gravel paths, their eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of intrusion. Visitors were carefully screened at the gates, their credentials examined, their purposes questioned. Even tradesmen delivering provisions found themselves subjected to thorough inspection before being admitted to the estate. Vivienne chafed at the restrictions like a bird in a gilded cage. She understood their necessity, understood that Calloway, cornered and desperate, represented genuine danger, but understanding didn't make the confinement easier to bear. She found herself pacing the library, the drawing room, the corridors, restless energy finding no outlet. Maximilian had barely slept since the fire at the assembly hall. Dark circles shadowed his grey eyes, and his usual immaculate appearance showed signs of strained cravat, tied hastily, coat wrinkled from hours of wear, hair dishevelled from running his hands through it during moments of frustration. He'd been coordinating with magistrates across 3 counties, sending and receiving dispatches at all hours, building a legal case that would ensure Calloway faced justice for his crimes. James Webster had returned from Bristol the previous evening with Sarah Collins's written testimony pages of careful handwriting detailing what she'd witnessed in Calloway's household, sworn before a magistrate and notarized properly. Mr. Bennet had compiled everything into a damning case file: financial records, witness statements, circumstantial evidence that painted a picture of a man capable of monstrous acts. But Calloway remained at large, a shadow haunting the edges of their lives. On the 3rd morning, as Vivienne and Maximilian sat in the morning room, reviewing correspondence and legal documents, a commotion at the front entrance announced an unexpected arrival. Lord Pemberton, Maximilian's uncle, had come calling. The elderly baron was a stern, imposing figure, despite his 70 years. He was dressed in old-fashioned black that seemed to absorb light, and he carried an ornate walking stick he clearly didn't need, wielding it more as a symbol of authority than a physical aid. His face was carved from the same unforgiving stone as his principles. He found them together, heads bent over paperwork, Vivienne's hand resting casually on Maximilian's arm as she pointed to something in a document. The picture of intimate partnership rather than proper courtship. Maximilian, a word, in private. Lord Pemberton's voice carried the expectation of immediate obedience that had cowed Maximilian as a boy. Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of Vivienne, Maximilian replied calmly, not rising from his seat, not showing the deference his uncle expected. She's my intended wife. She has every right to hear whatever concerns you've brought to my home. Lord Pemberton's lips thinned with disapproval until they nearly disappeared. Very well, since you insist on this. Display. Have you completely lost your senses, Maximilian? Courting a woman with no fortune, no significant family connections, and a reputation for public impertinence? Your parents would be absolutely appalled by this match. On the contrary, Maximilian said coolly, setting down his pen with deliberate precision, My mother would have adored Vivienne. She valued intelligence and spirit over empty social conventions and meaningless pedigrees. And my father, for all his considerable faults, taught me that true honor means protecting those who cannot protect themselves, standing for justice, even when it's inconvenient. This girl has clearly entrapped you somehow. This woman, Vivienne interrupted quietly, her voice steady despite the anger burning in her chest, is sitting right here, and I haven't entrapped anyone. The Duke makes his own choices, as free men generally do. Lord Pemberton's gaze swung to her, cold and assessing as a magistrate passing judgment. You should know, young woman, that I have considerable influence in this family. If Maximilian persists in this manifestly unsuitable match, there will be severe consequences. Social censure from the highest circles, withdrawal of family support and connection. He could lose his seat in Parliament through the machinations I can arrange. Let him try, Maximilian said flatly, rising now to his full height, towering over his uncle. My title and estates are mine by law and primogeniture, not by Uncle Pemberton's goodwill or approval. My seat in Parliament is secure unless I'm convicted of an actual crime, which seems unlikely given that I'm the one pursuing justice rather than fleeing it. And as for social censure, he moved to stand beside Vivienne, his hand finding hers. I care infinitely more for Vivienne's good opinion than for the approval of people who value ancient bloodlines over actual character. It was a declaration of independence, final and irrevocable, and Vivienne heard the weight of it in every syllable. Maximilian was choosing her over family pressure, over social expectation, over centuries of tradition that dictated his choices should be governed by duty rather than love. Lord Pemberton saw it too. His face hardened into something like granite. You're a fool, Maximilian. Just like your father, too soft, too sentimental, too willing to prioritize feeling over responsibility. Mark my words, this will end in disaster. This woman will be your ruin. He turned on his heel and stormed from the room, his walking stick striking the floor with sharp, angry reports. The front door slammed moments later with sufficient force to rattle the window panes. Silence settled over the morning room like snow. Vivienne took Maximilian's hand, lacing their fingers together. You just broke with your family. For me. Because of me. No. He raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with gentle reverence. I broke with one rigid, judgmental old man who has never approved of anything I've done in my entire life. Who criticized my father until the day he died and has been criticizing me ever since. My real family, the one I choose, the one that matters, starts with you. That afternoon, Webster arrived with news that shifted everything. They gathered in Maximilian's study Vivienne, Maximilian, Webster, Eleanor, and Mr. Bennet, forming a council of war around the massive desk. Calloway has made contact with Silas Crowe, Webster announced without preamble, spreading documents across the desk's leather surface. My sources in London's underworld say he's offered Crowe information about the Duke's assets, holdings, and movements in exchange for more time on his debts. Essentially, he's trying to trade intelligence for his life. What kind of information? Maximilian asked sharply, his jaw tightening. Details about your estate management, your investment portfolios, potential vulnerabilities in security. Crowe is apparently considering whether Calloway's information is valuable enough to warrant keeping him alive, rather than simply cutting his throat and dumping him in the Thames. Vivienne felt cold despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Crowe would actually kill him? Murder him outright? Without a moment's hesitation, Miss Thornton, Webster said grimly. Crowe didn't build his reputation on mercy. If Calloway can't pay, he's a dead man, which, paradoxically, gives us an opportunity we shouldn't waste. He unrolled a map across the desk, weighted at the corners with books. His thick finger traced a route outside Greystoke. Crowe has agreed to meet Calloway tomorrow night at midnight at this location, an abandoned mill, about 3 miles outside town. Remote, dark, perfect for clandestine dealings. If we can position the constabulary to witness the meeting, we can arrest both of them simultaneously. Calloway for attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. Crowe on multiple outstanding warrants including usury, assault, and suspected murder. It's an enormous risk, Mr. Bennet warned, his solicitor's caution asserting itself. If Calloway suspects a trap, he could disappear entirely. Flee to the continent, change his identity, vanish into the criminal underworld. Or he could do something even more desperate, strike out at those he blames for his downfall. He's already desperate, Maximilian pointed out, his voice hard. Already dangerous. This may be our only realistic chance to end this threat permanently. They began planning in earnest, discussing positions, timing, contingencies. Vivienne listened for several minutes before speaking. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Maximilian said immediately, flatly, brooking no argument. "He's been threatening me, terrorizing my family, trying to kill my mother. I have every right to see him apprehended, to witness the end of this nightmare. You have a right to be safe. That's the only right that matters to me at this moment." "I'll be safe," Vivienne insisted, meeting his eyes with equal determination. "Surrounded by constables and you. Protected. But I need to see this end with my own eyes, Maximilian. I need to witness that he can't hurt anyone else, that he's truly finished. Please, don't ask me to wait here in ignorance while you face danger on my behalf." He struggled visibly, duty and love warring across his features. Finally, he sighed with the weight of reluctant concession. "You stay in a closed carriage, behind armed guards, positioned well away from the actual confrontation. And if there's any danger, any sign of trouble whatsoever, you leave immediately. Those are my conditions. Non-negotiable." "Agreed." Eleanor squeezed Vivienne's hand under the table, solidarity between friends. The mill loomed against a moonlit sky like something from a Gothic novel, all stark angles and deep shadows. Its great water wheel stood motionless, timber rotting, windows dark as empty eye sockets. A stream rushed nearby, providing both cover noise and an eerie soundtrack to the night's enterprise. Vivienne waited in a closed carriage with Eleanor, positioned on the far side of the mill with 2 armed guards stationed outside. The carriage windows were covered, but a small gap in the curtain allowed her to see the mill's silhouette against the stars. Maximilian, Webster, Mr. Bennett, and 6 constables were hidden in various positions around the building behind trees, inside the mill itself, anywhere that provided concealment and a clear view of the meeting point. Waiting was torture. At precisely midnight, 2 figures approached along the path from the main road. Even at this distance, even in moonlight, Vivienne recognized Calloway's frame thinner now, moving with the furtive haste of hunted prey. The other man was shorter, broader, moving with the confidence of a predator rather than prey. Their voices carried in the still night air, words floating across the distance. "You said you had valuable information." Crow's voice was a growl, rough as gravel. "So far, all I've heard is whining about how some duke ruined your marriage prospects and destroyed your reputation. I don't pay for complaints, Calloway. I pay for actionable intelligence." "It's far more than that." Calloway's voice was desperate, high-pitched. "Radcliffe's estates are worth over £50,000. Liquid assets, investments, properties that could be liquidated quickly. If something were to happen to him, a riding accident, perhaps, a fall from his horse, the properties would fall into probate for months during the legal chaos. During that window, certain assets could be acquired by those who knew exactly where to look and how to access them. I have insider knowledge of which assets are most vulnerable, which can be moved without immediate detection. You're proposing I murder a duke?" Crow sounded almost amused, as if this were the most entertainingly audacious thing he'd heard in years. "You understand that's the kind of heat that brings the full weight of the crown down on everyone involved. Dukes don't die quietly. Not if it looks like a genuine accident, a riding accident, a fall, a tragic mishap exactly like my wife." He stopped abruptly, the words hanging in the cold air like an admission of guilt made tangible. From the shadows near the mill entrance, Maximilian's voice rang out clear and hard as a judge pronouncing sentence. "So, you did murder her, Lady Calloway, your wife. You just confessed to her murder." Calloway spun wildly, terror transforming his features. Constables emerged from concealment, like ghosts materializing from darkness, surrounding both men with drawn truncheons and the authority of law. "This is a trap," Calloway shouted, his voice cracking. "You bastard, Radcliffe. You orchestrated this entire thing." "This is justice," Maximilian corrected coldly, stepping fully into the moonlight. "You've just confessed to murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted murder in front of 8 witnesses with unimpeachable credentials. It's over, Calloway. Finally over." Calloway's face contorted with rage and desperation and something like madness. His hand moved to his coat. "He has a pistol." Webster's shout shattered the night. "He's armed." Everything happened at once, chaos erupting from stillness. Calloway pulled a pistol from his coat, swinging it wildly in Maximilian's direction. The constables rushed forward with shouts of alarm. Crow, seeing his opportunity, tried to run toward the tree line, and Calloway, in his panic and fury, fired. The shot went wild, missing everyone but producing a flash of fire and a report like thunder. The horses hitched to Vivian's carriage, already nervous from the tension and unfamiliar location, bolted in pure animal terror. The driver fought desperately to control them, hauling on the reins, but panicked horses are beyond reason. "Vivienne!" Maximilian's shout was pure anguish, inhuman in its terror. The carriage careened forward, bouncing over rough ground, the panicked horses dragging it toward the mill pond at a gallop. The guards tried desperately to reach it, but couldn't match the horse's terrified speed. Inside the carriage, Vivienne felt it tilt dangerously as one wheel hit a depression. They were going into the water, she could hear it now, rushing and dark and cold. Strong hands seized the lead horse's bridle. Maximilian, having sprinted across the intervening distance with impossible speed, hauled on the horse with all his considerable strength, using his weight and desperation to turn the panicked animals. The horse's hooves struck sparks from stones mere feet from the pond's edge. The carriage shuddered to a halt, tilting precariously. Vivienne tumbled out through the door. Eleanor managed to push open, falling directly into Maximilian's arms. He caught her, held her so tightly she could barely draw breath, his heart hammering against her ear like desperate drums. "I've got you," he whispered roughly, his voice breaking. "I've got you. You're safe. I've got you." Behind them, the constables had subdued both Calloway and Crow, wrestling them into manacles. The immediate danger was over. But Maximilian didn't release her. Couldn't. Not yet. Later, after Calloway and Crow had been taken away in chains, after statements had been given to magistrates, after the chaos had settled into something approaching order, Maximilian led Vivienne away from the others, down to where the mill stream ran clear and cold under moonlight. The water reflected stars. The night was cold but crystalline clear. "I need to say something," he began, his voice unsteady in a way she'd never heard before. "And I need to say it now, immediately, before my courage fails, or something else goes catastrophically wrong, or the universe decides we haven't suffered enough drama." Vivienne took his hand, feeling it tremble slightly. "I'm listening. When I saw that carriage careening toward the water, when I thought I might lose you to such a stupid, meaningless accident after everything we'd survived." He stopped, swallowing hard, his throat working. "I've faced many things in my life, Vivienne. Responsibility from the moment my parents died, duty that sometimes felt like it would crush me, the weight of expectations from an entire estate, an entire legacy. But I've never felt true, absolute fear until that moment. Because I realized with perfect, terrible clarity that nothing else matters. Not my title, not my wealth, not my seat in Parliament, not society's approval or my uncle's blessing, or any of it. Without you, none of it means anything. You're the only thing that makes any of it worthwhile." He dropped to one knee on the bank of the stream, the damp ground soaking into his expensive trousers, and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket with shaking hands. "Vivienne Thornton, you were deemed utterly unfit to be my wife by a world that values all the wrong things, pedigree over character, wealth over worth, compliance over courage, but you are everything I didn't know I needed until you challenged me in that ballroom and called me to account for my comfortable assumptions. You challenge me, inspire me, infuriate me, and make me want to be worthy of you every single day. I love you with everything I am and everything I hope to become. Will you marry me? Not because of duty or necessity or financial convenience, but because we choose each other freely, because we're partners, because love, in the end, is the only thing that truly matters." Tears streamed down Vivienne's face, cold trails in the November air, as she pulled him to his feet with both hands. "You impossible, wonderful, occasionally idiotic man. Yes, yes, of course, yes, 1,000 times yes." The ring he slid onto her finger was a sapphire surrounded by small, perfect diamonds, his mother's ring, exactly as he'd once mentioned. It caught the moonlight and seemed to glow with its own internal fire, blue as twilight, blue as her eyes. Their kiss was witnessed only by the stars and the rushing stream and perhaps a curious owl in a nearby tree. But it was perfect. Not tentative or performative or calculated for social advantage, but full of promise and certainty, and the terrifying hope that comes with choosing love over safety. When they finally returned to the others, walking hand in hand like conspirators sharing a magnificent secret, Eleanor took one look at Vivian's face and squealed with uncharacteristic lack of restraint. Mr. Bennet offered dignified congratulations, tinged with genuine warmth. Even the guards smiled, pleased to have witnessed something good emerge from the night's danger. Lord Thornton, who had arrived during the chaos and been filled in on events, pulled Maximilian aside while the others congratulated Vivienne. "You'll take care of my daughter?" It was both question and demand. "With my life," Maximilian promised without hesitation. "She'll want for nothing." "I wasn't talking about money or material comfort," Lord Thornton said quietly, his tired eyes searching Maximilian's face. "I meant her happiness, her freedom to be herself, to speak her mind, to challenge and grow. Can you promise me that?" "Especially that," Maximilian agreed with absolute sincerity. "That most of all." As dawn broke over Yorkshire, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and promise, Vivienne and Maximilian stood together in his study, watching the sunrise through windows that overlooked the estate's grounds. "We still have considerable challenges ahead," Vivienne murmured, leaning against his solid warmth. "Your uncle's active disapproval, society's endless gossip and speculation, learning how to actually be partners rather than just romantic lovers, navigating married life when we've only known each other for weeks." "I know." His arm tightened around her waist, possessive and protective and tender all at once. "But we'll face it together. We've already faced attempted murder, arson, social ruin, and your mother's kidnapping. Surely marriage can't be more difficult than that." "Have you?" She looked up at him with teasing eyes, her fear finally beginning to recede. "I seem to recall you once thought me utterly unfit to be anyone's wife, called me impertinent and presumptuous in front of half of Yorkshire. I was a complete and utter idiot." "You were. But I'm your idiot now, entirely and exclusively yours." "You are." She rose on her toes and kissed him softly, tasting promise and future and home. "And I wouldn't have it any other way, even when you're being insufferably aristocratic." Outside, Radcliffe Hall was waking to a new day. Servants began their morning routines with the comfortable rhythm of long practice. Birds sang in the gardens, celebrating sunrise and survival and the simple fact of another day. The world continued its indifferent turn, unconcerned with the human drama that had played out in darkness, but for Vivienne and Maximilian, everything had irrevocably changed. What had begun in anger and wounded pride, in a ballroom confrontation that scandalized society, had transformed, through challenge and growth, into love and genuine partnership. What society had deemed impossible, a match between a proud duke and an impoverished woman who refused to know her place, had become not just possible, but inevitable, right in ways that transcended social convention. And the duke, who had once publicly declared a spirited, opinionated woman unfit for marriage, had discovered she was, in fact, perfectly fit, perfectly suited, perfect. For him. Chapter 8. The Wedding and Ever After. Winter had settled over Greystoke with the kind of crystalline beauty that transforms even the mundane into something magical. Snow blanketed the Yorkshire countryside in undulating drifts of white that glittered like crushed diamonds under pale sunlight. Icicles hung from eaves like nature's chandeliers, and the world seemed wrapped in a hushed, expectant silence, the particular quiet that comes when snow muffles all sound and makes the familiar landscape strange and new. The wedding would be held at St. Michael's Church in the heart of Greystoke, followed by a reception at Radcliffe Hall. Despite the scandalously brief engagement, 6 weeks was practically indecent by society's standards, fodder for endless gossip. The preparations had consumed those weeks in a whirlwind of decisions, fittings, guest lists, and 1,000 details that seemed simultaneously crucial and absurd. Now, on the morning of her wedding day, Vivienne stood in her childhood bedroom for the last time as Miss Thornton. The room was exactly as it had been throughout her girlhood, faded wallpaper depicting pastoral scenes, a window seat where she'd spent countless hours reading forbidden books, a wardrobe holding gowns that had seen better days. Soon she would leave it forever, leave behind Miss Thornton entirely, and become someone new. Eleanor and Lady Catherine helped her dress with the careful reverence of priestesses performing a sacred ritual. The gown was ivory silk with delicate lace overlays, modest yet undeniably elegant. Maximilian had insisted on engaging the finest modiste from London. had actually travelled there himself to interview 3 candidates before selecting one, but Vivienne had chosen a design that reflected her own taste rather than slavishly, following current fashion. The result was something timelessly beautiful. Clean lines, exquisite craftsmanship, a dress that would look as lovely in 20 years as it did today. "I still can't quite believe this is happening," Lady Catherine said, her voice thick with tears as she fastened a strand of Pearl's family heirlooms, passed down through 4 generations of Thornton women around Vivienne's neck. Her fingers trembled slightly as she worked the clasp. "6 months ago, I despaired of you ever marrying. I thought your outburst at the Worthington ball had destroyed every chance at a decent match. And now you're becoming a duchess." "A duchess. I'm becoming Maximilian's wife," Vivienne corrected gently, meeting her mother's eyes in the mirror. "The duchess part is merely incidental, a side effect of loving the right person." Eleanor adjusted Vivienne's veil, fine Brussels lace, that had belonged to Maximilian's mother, a gesture that had moved Vivienne to tears when he'd presented it to her 3 weeks ago. "Are you nervous? Your hands are shaking." "Terrified," Vivienne admitted honestly, watching her own pale reflection. "Not about marrying him. I'm absolutely certain about that, more certain than I've been about anything in my life. But about everything else. Being a duchess, managing a great household with dozens of servants, navigating society as his wife, when half of them think I'm wildly unsuitable. What if I'm not capable? What if I fail him?" "You challenged a duke in front of all of Yorkshire society," Eleanor said dryly, arranging the veil's folds with practiced efficiency. "You survived a murderous fortune hunter who tried to kill you and your mother. You've already proven you can handle absolutely anything life throws at you, including stubborn aristocrats with guilt complexes." Vivienne laughed despite her nerves, the sound breaking the tension. "When you put it that way." "Exactly." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "Now stop worrying and go marry that man before he wears a hole in the church floor from pacing." St. Michael's was a medieval church, all grey stone and soaring arches, transformed for the occasion into something from a fairy tale. Winter greenery, holly and ivy, and pine boughs adorned every surface, their deep green a striking contrast against ancient stone. White roses, Vivienne's favourites. Though they'd cost a small fortune in December, filled massive arrangements at the altar and along the aisles. Candles glowed in every window and sconce, hundreds of them, warming the cold stone interior and filling the air with the scent of beeswax and roses. Maximilian stood at the altar in full formal dress, outwardly the picture of aristocratic composure, inwardly a churning mass of nerves that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. His hands, clasped behind his back where no one could see, were actually trembling. Lord Richard Ashford, Lady Cordelia's brother and one of Maximilian's few genuine friends, stood beside him as witness, looking entirely too amused by Maximilian's barely concealed anxiety. "You look like you're facing a firing squad rather than your own wedding," Richard murmured sotto voce, a smile playing at his lips. "Having second thoughts? It's not too late to flee through the vestry door." "Not a single second thought," Maximilian replied through clenched teeth, his jaw tight with tension. "But that doesn't mean I'm not absolutely terrified of disappointing her, of being less than she deserves, of failing to be the partner she needs. The woman who publicly called you out for your privilege and displacement of tenant farmers, who challenged your most fundamental assumptions, and then somehow fell in love with you anyway." Richard shook his head with genuine fondness. "I think you'd have to work extraordinarily hard to disappoint her, old friend. She knows exactly what she's getting, flaws and all." The church was surprisingly full. Over 200 guests packed the pews. Many had come out of sheer curiosity, eager to witness the scandalous conclusion of Greystoke's most talked-about romance. But many others had come out of genuine goodwill, moved by a story that had transformed from scandal into something that looked remarkably like a fairy tale. The tide of public opinion had shifted dramatically over the past weeks. What had once been deemed wildly inappropriate now struck people as refreshingly romantic. Even some of Maximilian's extended family were present, though conspicuously absent was Lord Pemberton, who had apparently left Yorkshire entirely rather than witness his nephew's disastrous marriage. Lady Cordelia sat in the third row, genuinely smiling, radiant with happiness. She'd become engaged to Captain James Harrington of the Royal Navy just 2 weeks ago, and the match seemed to suit her perfectly, all the adventure and passion she'd wanted, with a man who could give her the grand love story she deserved. The organ began the processional with a swell of sound that filled the ancient church. Maximilian's breath caught painfully in his throat. Vivienne appeared at the far end of the aisle on her father's arm, and the entire church seemed to hold its collective breath. Lord Thornton looked proud despite his age and recent worries, his back straight, his step careful but steady, but Maximilian barely registered him. He had eyes only for Vivienne. She was beautiful not in the conventional way society typically prized, not the porcelain doll perfection of faces painted on to please, but in a way that was uniquely, essentially hers. Intelligence shone in her violet eyes, even from this distance. Determination marked the set of her jaw, that stubborn tilt he'd come to love. And love unmistakable, overwhelming love, radiated from the way she looked at him, as if he were the only person in the entire crowded church. Their eyes met and held as she walked toward him. The church, the watching guests, the world itself seemed to fade into insignificance. There was only Vivienne, walking toward him, choosing him, becoming his. When Lord Thornton placed Vivienne's hand in Maximilian's, that moment of transfer, of trust, the older man whispered urgently, "Take care of her heart. It's far braver than she knows, and more fragile than she'll ever admit." "I will," Maximilian promised, his voice rough with emotion. "With my life, every day. I swear it." The vicar, a rotund man with kind eyes who'd known the Thornton family for decades, began the ancient ceremony. The traditional words took on new weight, new meaning, when applied to their particular story. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony, which is an honorable estate, instituted of God." When the moment came for vows, Maximilian's voice was steady but raw with emotion he made no attempt to hide. "I, Maximilian Edward Radcliffe, take thee, Vivienne Catherine Thornton, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. This is my solemn vow." Vivienne's eyes shone with unshed tears as she responded, her voice clear and certain. "I, Vivienne Catherine Thornton, take thee, Maximilian Edward Radcliffe, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. This is my solemn vow." The ring he slid onto her finger was a new one, a simple gold band to accompany his mother's sapphire engagement ring. But simple on the outside didn't mean simple within. Engraved on the inside, where only she would see, were 4 words: "You were always fit." Later, when she discovered the inscription in private, she would weep. "You may kiss your bride." Maximilian cupped her face gently with both hands, mindful of all the watching eyes, mindful that this moment would be discussed and dissected for weeks to come, and kissed her with such tender reverence that several guests, even the cynical ones, sighed audibly. It was not a passionate kiss, not theatrical, but something deeper, a promise made physical, a commitment sealed. When they broke apart, Vivienne whispered for his ears alone, "Hello, husband." "Hello, wife," he whispered back, and the simple words felt more momentous than any grand declaration. Radcliffe Hall had been transformed into something from a winter fairy tale. Evergreen boughs wound around banisters and doorframes. White roses impossibly expensive in December, requiring 3 separate shipments from London hothouses, adorned every surface. The great hall glowed with the warmth of 100 candles and 3 massive fireplaces. A feast had been laid that would have impressed royalty. Roasted game birds, beef Wellington, salmon in aspic, winter vegetables prepared in a dozen ways, elaborate pastries and confections that were more art than food. But the true transformation, the detail that scandalized some guests and moved others to tears, was in the guest list. Mixed among the aristocrats and country gentry were tenant families from the Radcliffe estates, the very people who had benefited from the reforms Maximilian had implemented over the past months. The Mitchells were there, including Mr. Mitchell himself, who had been given a position managing the new tenant school and looked 10 years younger for having purpose again. Other families who had received fair leases, improved housing, and access to education sat at tables alongside their landlord, breaking centuries of rigid social hierarchy. It was wildly unconventional. Some of the more traditional guests were visibly scandalized, whispering behind fans and gloves. Maximilian didn't care even slightly. During the wedding breakfast, As the first courses were being served, he stood to give the traditional speech. The room quieted immediately, attention focusing on the Duke. "My friends, family, and honored guests," he began, his voice carrying easily across the great hall. "6 months ago, if you had asked me what a duke's duty entailed, I would have given you a very specific answer. I would have told you that our duty is to maintain tradition, preserve the established social order, and marry appropriately, by which I meant someone with the right bloodlines, the right family connections, the right fortune to enhance our estates." He paused, looking down at Vivienne seated beside him, her hand warm in his. "Then I met a woman who systematically challenged every assumption I'd ever held about duty, about responsibility, about what truly matters. She looked at my privilege and saw not entitlement but responsibility. She looked at my power and demanded I use it justly rather than merely legally. She looked at me not at my title, not at my wealth or estates or seat in Parliament, but at me, the actual man beneath all that, and she saw someone who could be better than he was." His voice roughened with genuine emotion, control slipping. "Vivienne Radcliffe, and yes, I will never ever tire of saying that name is the bravest, most brilliant woman I have ever known. She was deemed utterly unfit to be my wife by standards that prized obedience over intelligence, decorative silence over courageous speech, passive compliance over active character. But she is perfectly fit, perfectly suited. Perfect, full stop." He raised his glass, and 200 guests followed suit. "To my wife, who makes me want to be worthy of her every single day of my life. And to all of you who have joined us today, thank you for witnessing the beginning of our adventure together." "To the Duke and Duchess," the crowd echoed, glasses raised high. Vivienne rose then. Surprising everyone, tradition dictated that brides remained modestly seated during toasts. Several guests gasped audibly. "I'm going to break with tradition," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying the same conviction it had carried when she'd challenged Maximilian in that ballroom months ago. "Because my husband has taught me that some traditions deserve breaking, that some rules exist only to be questioned." Smiles spread through the crowd, murmurs of approval. "6 months ago, I made what society called a scene at a ball. I publicly challenged a duke, questioned his assumptions, and he responded by calling me unfit to be anyone's wife." She paused, letting that sink in. He wasn't entirely wrong. I was unfit for the kind of wife he thought he needed at the time. Decorative, docile, unchallenging, existing merely to reflect well on him. She looked at Maximilian with such transparent love that it took his breath away. But it turns out he didn't need that kind of wife at all. He needed a partner, an equal, someone who would love him not, despite his flaws, but with full knowledge of them, who would challenge him to grow while supporting the best parts of who he already was. And that I can do, that I choose to do, freely and gladly, every day, for the rest of our lives. She raised her own glass, the gesture mirroring his, "To my husband, who proved that even dukes can learn, can grow, can change when they're brave enough to question themselves, and to partnership in marriage, in justice, and in love." The applause was thunderous, genuine, moving. When the ballroom doors opened to reveal the musicians and space for dancing, Maximilian led Vivienne to the center of the floor for their first dance as husband and wife. The waltz was slower than the one they'd danced at, that fateful assembly, more intimate, more weighted with meaning. Vivienne fit perfectly in his arms, as if she'd been designed specifically to rest against his shoulder just so. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. "Deliriously, impossibly happy. You? More than I ever thought possible. More than I knew how to imagine." He twirled her gently, and she laughed, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. "Though I'm still half expecting someone to pinch me and wake me from this dream. This is real," she promised, her hand tightening on his shoulder. "We're real. This happiness is real and earned and ours. Thank God for that." As other couples joined them on the floor, Lord and Lady Thornton dancing with surprising grace, Eleanor with a young barrister named Thomas Wright who'd been courting her, Lady Cordelia with her captain looking besotted, the celebration spread like warmth through the great hall. Eventually, as the reception continued without them, Vivienne and Maximilian slipped away to steal a quiet moment in the library, the room where so much had begun months ago at Blackwood Manor, where they'd first truly seen each other. "Do you remember that night at Blackwood Manor?" Vivienne asked, standing in the exact spot where they'd argued about Adam Smith and economic theory and human suffering. When we stood almost exactly here and argued about economics and responsibility. I remember thinking you were the single most infuriating woman I'd ever met in my entire life. He came to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist in a gesture that had become natural, familiar, and simultaneously the most fascinating. I couldn't stop thinking about you, even when I desperately wanted to. I thought you were arrogant and willfully blind to suffering that was convenient to ignore. I was, completely and deservedly so. But you've changed, truly changed. She turned in his arms to face him. The tenant reforms, the school, the fair lease agreements, the model you're creating for other estates. You've accomplished more genuine good in 6 months than most landowners manage in entire lifetimes. You inspired all of it, every single reform. He kissed her forehead tenderly. You made me see what I was too comfortable, too privileged to notice on my own. We inspired each other, she corrected firmly. You gave me hope that people can genuinely change, that the system can be reformed from within rather than requiring complete revolution. I was so angry before I met you, so hopeless about any possibility of justice. You showed me a different path, reform rather than destruction. Partnership, he murmured. The word, a talisman. Partnership, she agreed, sealing it with a kiss. 1 year later, the scene. Maximilian's study, where winter sunlight streams through tall windows, warming dark wood and leather. He sits reviewing estate reports, making notes in the margins, plans for spring planting and summer improvements. Vivian enters, bundled in a warm cashmere shawl, despite the fire roaring in the hearth. Her figure is subtly but unmistakably rounded with early pregnancy, 4 months along, healthy and glowing. She settles into the chair beside his desk, her chair now, brought in months ago when she'd begun working alongside him on estate management, her opinions and insights proving invaluable. The school dedication ceremony went beautifully, she reports, her voice warm with satisfaction. Mrs. Mitchell is proving to be an absolutely excellent headmistress. We have 23 children enrolled already, and 5 adults attending the evening literacy classes. The response has exceeded every expectation. And the tenant family's winter provisions? All distributed? Every family accounted for. No one on our estates will go hungry this winter, and everyone has adequate fuel for heating. She pauses. That particular gleam in her eyes that he's learned means she has a new, ambitious project forming. Maximilian, I've been thinking about expanding the program beyond our own estates. There are dozens of other properties throughout Yorkshire that could benefit from similar reforms. If we could document our methods, create a replicable model, perhaps even publish a guide, we could help far more people than just our own tenants. You want to start a movement? He says, smiling with absolute lack of surprise. Of course you do. Why would you limit yourself to merely reforming one estate when you could reform all of Yorkshire? Is that terribly ambitious of me? It's terribly you, which I love beyond measure. He sets aside his paperwork and carefully pulls her into his lap, mindful of her condition. How are you feeling? Should you be resting more? The doctor said. I'm pregnant, not ill or invalid, she interrupts with fond exasperation. Stop fussing every moment. I'll never stop fussing. You're carrying our child, my child. The thought still fills them both with wonder and bone-deep terror in equal measure. Are you worried? She asks quietly, her hand seeking his. About being a father? Absolutely terrified. What if I repeat my uncle's mistakes? What if I'm too rigid, too demanding, too focused on duty over love? You won't be. You couldn't be. She takes his hand and places it gently on the swell of her stomach. Because you have something, Lord Pemberton, never possessed genuine self-awareness and the willingness to change, to grow, to admit when you're wrong. This child will have a father who listens, who admits mistakes, who believes in justice and kindness over blind tradition. That's everything any child truly needs. A knock interrupts the moment. Eleanor enters without ceremony. She's been staying with them for the Christmas holidays, along with her father, and has long since abandoned formality. Sorry to interrupt your domestic bliss, she says with a grin, but Lord and Lady Thornton just arrived. They're in the drawing room, demanding tea and grandchild updates. Also, she produces a letter with an impressive seal. This just arrived from Westminster. Something about your reforms bill. Maximilian reaches for it eagerly, breaking the seal with barely controlled excitement. He scans the official text, and a slow smile of genuine triumph spreads across his face. The Tenant Protection and Agricultural Reform Bill passed its first reading in the House of Commons. It's being sent to committee for detailed review. He looks at Vivienne with shining eyes. This is real. This could actually become law. Vivienne throws her arms around his neck, laughing with pure joy. Maximilian, that's wonderful. That's everything we hoped for. It's just a start, a small beginning. He holds her close, breathing in her scent. But none of it would have happened without you challenging me to imagine better, to do better. That's what partners do. We make each other better. They kiss, while Eleanor makes exaggerated sounds of disgust and then dissolves into affectionate laughter. The great hall at Radcliffe Hall is filled with people, noise, warmth, life, family and friends, and tenant families and servants, all boundaries deliberately blurred for this communal Christmas feast. The long tables groan under the weight of food. Candles glow everywhere. Children laugh and play. It's chaotic and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. Maximilian stands with Vivienne beside him, surveying the gathered crowd. His hand finds hers instinctively, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "A year ago," he says quietly, meant only for her ears, "I would have told you this was completely impossible." A duke and an impoverished woman with dangerously radical ideas about justice and equality. Society would never accept such a match. "And yet here we are," she replies, leaning into his warmth. "Defying impossibility daily. Here we are." He raises her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles, utterly unfit for the constrained life we were supposed to lead, and perfectly suited for the life we've chosen to build together. "I love you," she says simply, the words needing no embellishment. "I love you more. Impossible to quantify. Want to wager on it?" She laughs that sound he'll never tire of hearing, and the joy in it encompasses everything: hope and promise and partnership and home. In the corner, Lord Thornton watches his daughter with misty eyes, his heart full. Lady Catherine clutches his hand, equally overcome. Eleanor catches Vivienne's eye across the crowded hall and raises her glass in a private toast, her smile saying everything words couldn't. And Maximilian pulls his wife, his partner, his love, his perfectly fit match close, thinking about the child they'll welcome in spring, the reforms they'll fight for together, the life they're building, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. What began with anger and wounded pride has become love and genuine partnership. What society deemed impossible has become their beautiful, imperfect reality. And the woman once called Unfit has become not just a duchess, but a force for change, a partner in every sense, and the absolute love of one man's life. She was never unfit. She was simply waiting for someone brave enough to truly see her, and he was waiting for someone courageous enough to challenge him to become better. In the end, they were exactly, perfectly what each other needed. And so concludes the tale of Vivienne and Maximilian, a story of how love transformed pride into partnership, how courage challenged privilege into purpose, and how two people deemed impossibly unsuited discovered they were perfectly fit for each other. If this story touched your heart, made you believe in second chances, or reminded you that love often begins where we least expect it, please show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement helps us bring more beautiful stories like this one to readers who need them. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our next romantic journey. We have more Victorian romances, Regency tales, and sweeping historical love stories coming your way. Now, we want to hear from you. What was your favorite moment from Vivienne and Maximilian's story? Which scene made your heart race? Was it their first confrontation at the ball, the library confession, the proposal by the mill stream? Team Vivienne or Team Maximilian? Who changed more throughout their journey? What type of romance should we narrate next? Enemies to lovers? Childhood friends? Forbidden romance? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your feedback shapes the stories we share next. Thank you for spending these hours with Vivienne and Maximilian. Thank you for believing in love stories where women challenge conventions and men rise to meet them as equals. Thank you for being part of our community of romance readers who believe that the best stories aren't just about finding love, they're about becoming better people because of it. Until our next story, remember, you are never unfit for the right person. The right love doesn't require you to shrink yourself. It invites you to grow. See you in the next tale.